What you're about to hear will change how you see the wilderness forever. I'm about to share 11 real documented cases where people just like you went camping and encountered pure terror. These aren't stories from horror movies or internet fiction. These are police reports, survivor testimonies, and documented attacks that happened to real people seeking nothing more than a peaceful night under the stars. Some of these victims made it home to tell their stories. Others didn't. But before we dive into these nightmare scenarios, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever felt that primal fear in the wilderness, that gut instinct that something isn't right, hit that subscribe button right now and join the Verified Fears family. Because what you're about to learn might just save your life the next time you venture into the woods. These stories will haunt you, but they'll also prepare you. Let's begin with a case that proves sometimes the most dangerous predators in the forest walk on two legs. Let's move to our first story. The year was 1977, and two young women named Shayna Weiss and Jana Copeland were living what many would consider the ultimate adventure. These college friends had embarked on an ambitious transcontinental bicycle tour, pedaling their way across the United States with nothing but their determination, a few camping supplies, and dreams of seeing the country from a perspective most people never experience. They had started their journey weeks earlier, traveling through small towns and vast landscapes, documenting their adventure and proving that two determined women could conquer thousands of miles on two wheels. Their families back home followed their progress through postcards and occasional phone calls, proud of their daughter's courage and independence. On the evening of June 22nd, Shayna and Jana had made camp at Klein Falls State Park in Oregon, a scenic spot known for its beautiful waterfall and peaceful camping areas. They had chosen what seemed like the perfect location, a quiet area away from the main camping facilities where they could enjoy some solitude after long days of cycling. The two women set up their small tent just off the park road, close enough to civilization to feel safe, but secluded enough to enjoy the tranquility they had grown to love during their cross-country adventure. They prepared a simple meal, chatted about the next day's route, and settled into their sleeping bags as darkness fell over the Oregon wilderness. What happened next would haunt investigators and the local community for decades to come. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, while both women were sound asleep in their tent, the peaceful silence of the campground was shattered by the roar of a pickup truck engine. But this wasn't a late-night camper arriving or someone taking a wrong turn. This truck was heading straight for their tent at full speed. The vehicle, driven by a man named David Roth, deliberately drove directly over the tent where Shayna and Jana lay sleeping, crushing their bodies under the weight of the truck's wheels and axles. The impact was devastating. Both women suffered severe injuries as the truck rolled over them, breaking bones and causing internal trauma that should have been fatal. The tent fabric tore apart around them. Sleeping bags were shredded, and their camping equipment was scattered and destroyed. But incredibly, impossibly, both women survived the initial attack. Dazed, broken, and in excruciating pain, they managed to crawl out from the wreckage of their tent, probably running on pure adrenaline and the human body's extraordinary ability to function even under the most extreme trauma. But David Roth wasn't finished. After running them over with his truck, he got out of the vehicle and approached the two severely injured women with an axe. What followed was a brutal attack that defied comprehension. Roth began striking both women with the axe, inflicting massive head injuries and trauma that medical professionals later said should have killed them instantly. He hit Shayna multiple times in the head with the blunt side of the axe, fracturing her skull and causing severe brain trauma. Jana received similar treatment, suffering multiple skull fractures and brain injuries that would affect her for the rest of her life. After the axe attack, Roth apparently believed both women were dead. He left them lying in their own blood among the destroyed remains of their campsite and drove away into the night, likely thinking he had committed the perfect crime in a remote location where the bodies might not be discovered for days or even weeks. The campground fell silent again, except for the labored breathing of two women who refused to die despite suffering injuries that should have been instantly fatal. What happened next demonstrates the incredible human will to survive. Despite their massive head injuries, broken bones, and severe trauma, both women regained consciousness. Shayna, despite her skull fractures and brain injury, managed to crawl to the nearby road. Bleeding profusely and barely conscious, she flagged down a passing motorist in the early morning hours. The driver, horrified by her condition and barely coherent account of what had happened, immediately called for emergency medical assistance. Paramedics and police arrived to find a scene that first responders later described as one of the most shocking they had ever encountered. Jaina was discovered still alive near the destroyed campsite, covered in blood and barely breathing. Both women were rushed to the hospital in critical condition, with doctors amazed that they had survived injuries that by all medical logic should have killed them. The emergency room staff worked frantically to stabilize them, performing emergency surgery to address the skull fractures and brain trauma caused by the axe attack. During their recovery, both women were able to provide descriptions of their attacker to police. They described David Roth in detail, his appearance, his truck, and the calculated nature of his attack. The investigation revealed that this wasn't a random act of violence or a case of mistaken identity. Roth had specifically targeted the two women, though his motives remained unclear. Some investigators theorized it was a sexually motivated attack, while others believed it might have been connected to his mental state or substance abuse issues. Police launched an intensive manhunt for David Roth, using the descriptions provided by the survivors and evidence collected from the crime scene. They found tire tracks matching his truck, blood evidence, and other physical proof that supported the women's account of events. However, what happened next added another layer of horror to an already unthinkable crime. While police were still searching for Roth and the women were fighting for their lives in the hospital, the attacker returned to the scene. Several days after the initial attack, Roth came back to Klein Falls State Park, possibly to check if his victims had been discovered or to remove evidence. This return to the crime scene ultimately led to his capture. Park rangers and police, who had increased patrols in the area following the attack, spotted him and were able to make an arrest. During questioning, Roth's behavior was described as erratic and disturbing. He showed little remorse for the attack and seemed disconnected from the severity of his actions. Mental health evaluations conducted during his time in custody revealed a complex psychological profile, but nothing that could fully explain the calculated brutality of his attack on two innocent women who had simply been pursuing their dreams of adventure. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated by the severe nature of the victims' injuries. Both Shayna and Jaina suffered permanent brain damage from the axe attack, affecting their memory and cognitive function. Despite these challenges, they were able to testify about their ordeal, showing remarkable courage in facing their attacker in court. Their testimony, combined with the overwhelming physical evidence, led to Roth's conviction on multiple charges, including attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon. The case sent shockwaves through the camping and cycling communities across the United States. Here were two experienced, safety-conscious young women who had taken reasonable precautions and chosen what appeared to be a safe, established camping location, yet they had still fallen victim to a predator who specifically sought out vulnerable targets in remote areas. The attack highlighted the reality that no amount of preparation or caution can completely eliminate the risk posed by individuals who view remote camping areas as hunting grounds for potential victims. Both women survived, but their lives were forever changed by that night at Klein Falls. The brain injuries they sustained affected their cognitive abilities, memory function, and overall quality of life. Their planned bicycle tour across America ended abruptly in a hospital intensive care unit rather than at their intended destination. The psychological trauma of the attack added another layer of suffering to their physical injuries, leaving them with PTSD and anxiety that would take years of therapy to address. The Klein Falls attack remains one of the most brutal documented cases of violence against campers in American history. It serves as a stark reminder that even in designated camping areas with some level of oversight and security, determined predators can still find opportunities to attack vulnerable victims. The case also demonstrates the importance of situational awareness, camping in groups when possible, and trusting instincts when something feels wrong about a location or situation. This story isn't just about two women who survived an unthinkable attack. It's about the reality that some people view the wilderness as their personal hunting ground, where they can act out their most violent fantasies against victims who have nowhere to run and no immediate access to help. The next time you set up camp in a remote location, remember Shayna and Jaina. And remember that survival sometimes depends on being prepared for threats that go far beyond wild animals or natural disasters. Let's move to our second story. There are certain moments in life when your instincts scream at you that something is fundamentally wrong, even when your rational mind can't identify the specific threat. For Mark and Jennifer Thompson, a couple in their 30s who considered themselves experienced outdoor enthusiasts, that moment came during what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend camping trip in the dense forests of northern Michigan. They had been camping together for over 8 years, exploring remote wilderness areas across the Midwest. And they prided themselves on their preparedness and wilderness awareness. They knew how to identify animal tracks, could start a fire in wet conditions, and always informed multiple people of their exact location and expected return date. Nothing in their extensive camping experience had prepared them for what they would encounter on the night of September 15th, 2018. The Thompsons had chosen a remote section of the Hiawatha National Forest for their autumn camping trip, specifically seeking solitude away from the crowded campgrounds that filled up every weekend during peak season. They had hiked approximately 3 miles from the nearest access road, carrying their gear to a small clearing beside a gentle creek that provided fresh water and a natural sound barrier they thought would enhance their peaceful retreat. The location was perfect by every measure they had learned to evaluate over their years of camping. Fresh water source, natural wind protection, elevated ground for drainage, and enough open space to set up their tent while still being surrounded by the comforting presence of towering pine and hardwood trees. Their first day had been exactly what they had hoped for. They spent the afternoon exploring the immediate area, collecting firewood, and setting up their campsite with the methodical care that had become second nature to them. Jennifer prepared their dinner while Mark arranged their gear and secured their food in bear-proof containers, following all the protocols they had learned through years of wilderness camping. As evening approached, they enjoyed a quiet meal beside their campfire, discussing plans for the next day's hiking route and simply appreciating the profound silence that only deep wilderness can provide. As darkness settled over the forest, Mark and Jennifer retreated to their tent around 10:30 p.m., planning to wake early and break camp by sunrise to maximize their hiking time. The forest around them seemed to embrace the kind of deep, peaceful quiet that city dwellers travel hundreds of miles to experience. The gentle sound of the nearby creek provided a natural white noise that should have helped them sleep soundly. For the first few hours, everything seemed perfect. They dozed comfortably in their sleeping bags, occasionally waking to the distant call of an owl or the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. All the normal sounds of a healthy forest ecosystem that actually provided reassurance rather than concern. But around 2:30 in the morning, Jennifer woke with a start. Something had changed in the forest around them, though she couldn't immediately identify what had triggered her sudden alertness. The normal night sounds seemed muted, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. She lay still in her sleeping bag, listening intently and trying to determine what had awakened her so abruptly. Mark was still sleeping soundly beside her, and for several minutes she convinced herself that it had probably been nothing more than a vivid dream or perhaps a distant sound carried on the wind. Then she heard it, or rather, she became aware of what she wasn't hearing. The gentle babbling of the creek that had provided constant background noise throughout the evening had stopped completely. In the absolute silence that followed, Jennifer became acutely aware of her own heartbeat and Mark's steady breathing. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She had the unmistakable sensation that they were being watched. Moving as quietly as possible, Jennifer reached over and gently shook Mark awake. When he opened his eyes, she pressed her finger to his lips to signal for silence, then pointed toward the tent wall. Mark immediately understood that something was wrong. In their years of camping together, they had developed an unspoken communication system for situations where noise might attract unwanted attention from wildlife. But as Mark became fully alert and began listening to their surroundings, he realized that whatever was out there wasn't behaving like any animal they had ever encountered. For the next 20 minutes, they lay completely motionless in their tent, straining to hear any sound that might explain the oppressive feeling of being observed. The silence was so complete, it seemed unnatural, as if every living creature in the forest had suddenly vanished or was hiding from some threat. Then, just as Jennifer was beginning to wonder if they were letting their imaginations run wild, Mark spotted something that made his blood run cold. Through the thin fabric of their tent, illuminated by the faint starlight filtering through the forest canopy, he could see the silhouette of a human figure standing motionless approximately 50 feet away. The figure was positioned between two large pine trees, and it appeared to be facing directly toward their tent. Mark carefully nudged Jennifer and guided her gaze toward the shadow. When she saw it too, her heart began racing so fast she was afraid the sound might somehow be audible to whoever was watching them. They remained frozen, hoping that the figure would move on, that it was perhaps just another camper who had gotten lost or was passing through their area. But as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the figure never moved. It stood in the exact same position, maintaining what appeared to be constant surveillance of their campsite. The complete stillness of the watcher was perhaps the most unnerving aspect of the entire situation. No shifting weight, no adjustment of position, no normal human fidgeting or movement. After what Mark later estimated was about 30 minutes, Jennifer spotted a second figure. This one was positioned to their left, perhaps 40 feet away, also standing perfectly still among the trees. Like the first figure, it appeared to be facing their tent and maintaining a silent watch. The realization that there were multiple watchers sent waves of terror through both of them. This wasn't a chance encounter with a lost hiker or even a single disturbed individual. This was coordinated surveillance by multiple people. Over the next hour, as their eyes adjusted more completely to the darkness and they forced themselves to carefully scan the tree line around their campsite, Mark and Jennifer identified what appeared to be at least 10 to 15 figures stationed in a rough circle around their tent. Each figure maintained the same unnaturally still posture, creating a ring of silent watchers that surrounded their campsite completely. The figures were spaced far enough apart that they couldn't make out specific details about any individual, but close enough that there was no doubt they were human forms deliberately positioned to observe the tent. The psychological terror of being surrounded by silent watchers was unlike anything either of them had experienced. They whispered to each other in voices so quiet they could barely hear their own words, trying to formulate some plan of action. Should they try to break camp and run? Should they make noise to scare off the watchers? Should they call out and try to communicate? Every option seemed to carry the risk of escalating the situation in unpredictable ways. As the night wore on, the figures occasionally moved, but never in ways that suggested they were leaving or losing interest. Sometimes a figure would shift positions, moving from one tree to another, but always maintaining the same silent observation. At one point, Mark was certain he saw two figures communicate with each other through subtle hand signals, confirming that this was an organized group activity rather than coincidental positioning by unrelated individuals. The most disturbing aspect of the entire ordeal was the complete silence maintained by the watchers. No talking, no obvious communication, no sounds of movement through the underbrush. Just the silent presence of multiple human figures maintaining surveillance throughout the night. Jennifer later described the feeling as being studied like laboratory specimens, as if they were subjects in some kind of experiment being conducted by researchers who had no intention of making contact. Dawn began to break around 6:15 a.m., and as the first light filtered through the forest canopy, Mark and Jennifer expected to finally get a clear look at their mysterious watchers. But as visibility improved, something even more disturbing happened. The figures began to disappear, not walking away or retreating into deeper forest, but simply vanishing from their positions. One moment, Jennifer could clearly see a figure standing beside a distinctive, lightning-struck tree, and the next moment, the spot was empty. By full daylight, every single watcher had vanished without a trace. Mark and Jennifer waited another hour before emerging from their tent. And when they finally worked up the courage to investigate the areas where the figures had been standing, they found no evidence whatsoever of human presence. No footprints in the soft forest floor, no broken branches or disturbed vegetation, no discarded items or any other signs that multiple people had spent hours standing in those locations. They broke camp immediately and hiked back to their vehicle at a pace that was almost a run. During the entire 3-mile hike out, they both felt the persistent sensation that they were still being watched, though they never spotted any followers. When they reached their car, they sat inside with the doors locked for several minutes, trying to process what they had experienced. The Thompsons reported the incident to local authorities, but with no physical evidence and no clear crime committed, there was little law enforcement could do. The case was filed as an unusual incident report, joining a small but growing collection of similar accounts from the same general area of the Hiawatha National Forest. What makes their story particularly credible is their extensive camping experience and the detailed, consistent account they provided both immediately after the incident and in follow-up interviews months later. This case represents a particularly unsettling category of camping horror. The encounter with organized groups of unknown individuals who seem to treat remote campsites as locations for surveillance or psychological intimidation. Unlike attacks motivated by robbery or violence, these watchers never make contact or demands, leaving their victims to wonder about motives and intentions that may be far more disturbing than simple criminal activity. Let's move to our third story. In the remote wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest, There have been numerous documented cases of encounters with individuals who appear to have completely abandoned civilized society, choosing instead to live as territorial guardians of specific forest regions. These so-called wild men represent a disturbing reality that most outdoor enthusiasts never consider when planning their wilderness adventures. For Sarah Martinez, a 28-year-old experienced hiker and wildlife photographer from Seattle, her encounter with one such individual during a solo backpacking trip through the Olympic National Forest would fundamentally change her understanding of who or what might be living in the deepest parts of America's wilderness areas. Sarah had been planning this particular expedition for over 6 months, researching trail conditions, weather patterns, and wildlife activity in a section of the Olympic Peninsula known for its old-growth forests and relative isolation from popular hiking destinations. As a professional wildlife photographer, she often sought out remote locations where she could document animal behavior without the interference of crowds or human activity. Her goal for this trip was to spend 5 days photographing the Roosevelt elk population during their autumn rutting season, a behavior that required patience, stealth, and the kind of deep forest access that only experienced solo hikers typically attempt. The trail she had chosen was listed in official park documentation as a moderate difficulty day hike. But Sarah's research had revealed that very few people actually completed the full route to its terminus at a high alpine meadow known locally as Hidden Valley. Most hikers turned back after the first few miles due to poorly maintained trail conditions, confusing trail markers, and the physical demands of navigating through dense, old-growth forest with minimal visibility. These factors made it perfect for Sarah's purposes, as she could expect to encounter wildlife that hadn't been habituated to human presence. On the morning of October 3rd, 2019, Sarah began her hike at the official trailhead, carrying approximately 40 pounds of camping gear and photography equipment. The first 3 miles followed a well-established path through managed forest land, with clear trail markers and evidence of regular maintenance. But as she progressed deeper into the wilderness, the trail became increasingly difficult to follow. What had started as a clearly defined path gradually deteriorated into a series of game trails and faint impressions in the forest floor that required constant attention to navigate successfully. Around mile 4, Sarah began noticing something unusual about the forest around her. Scattered along what appeared to be the main trail were items of camping equipment that seemed to have been abandoned by previous hikers. She first encountered a high-quality backpack hanging from a tree branch about 8 feet off the ground, positioned in a way that seemed deliberately placed rather than accidentally lost. The backpack was partially open, and she could see that it still contained personal items, including clothing, food supplies, and what appeared to be identification documents. As she continued hiking, Sarah found more abandoned equipment at irregular intervals along the trail. An expensive sleeping bag stuffed inside a garbage bag and wedged between 2 rocks. A camp stove sitting on a fallen log with its fuel canister removed. A pair of hiking boots placed neatly side by side on a large boulder, as if someone had simply decided to continue their journey barefoot. Most disturbing was a tent that had been set up completely, stakes driven into the ground and rainfly properly secured, but with no occupants and no evidence of recent use. The pattern of abandoned equipment created an increasingly ominous atmosphere as Sarah hiked deeper into the forest. Each discovery made her more uneasy, but her experience and professional determination convinced her to continue toward her planned campsite. She rationalized that the equipment might have been left by researchers, or perhaps represented supply caches established by regular visitors to the area. However, the random nature of the abandonment and the fact that valuable items were simply left exposed to weather and wildlife suggested something more disturbing. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, as Sarah was photographing what appeared to be fresh elk tracks near a stream crossing. She heard the sound of someone approaching through the forest behind her. The footsteps were deliberate and unhurried, suggesting someone who was comfortable moving through the dense undergrowth without concern for stealth. Sarah turned around, expecting to encounter another hiker or perhaps a park ranger checking on solo travelers in the remote area. What she saw instead was a man who appeared to have been living in the wilderness for an extended period. His appearance was shocking even to someone like Sarah, who had extensive experience with outdoorsmen and wilderness professionals. His hair and beard were long, matted, and filled with debris from the forest. His clothing consisted of what appeared to be layers of different garments that had been patched and repatched with materials that included both manufactured fabrics and what looked like animal hide. His skin was deeply tanned and weathered, with visible scars and abrasions that suggested years of exposure to harsh outdoor conditions. But it was his eyes that Sarah found most disturbing. They held an intensity and intelligence that indicated this wasn't simply a homeless individual who had wandered into the forest, but someone who had made a deliberate choice to live in this environment and had adapted to it successfully. When he spoke, his voice was clear and articulate, though his words carried an underlying threat that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You're in my territory," he said simply, positioning himself directly in the center of the trail so that Sarah would have to move around him to continue in either direction. "This land belongs to me. I've been watching you since you entered my domain, and I know everything you've been doing here." His tone wasn't aggressive or shouting, but carried the absolute certainty of someone who believed completely in his right to control access to this area. Sarah attempted to remain calm and de-escalate the situation. She explained that she was a wildlife photographer conducting research, that she had appropriate permits for backcountry camping, and that she had no intention of disturbing his living situation or reporting his presence to authorities. She offered to turn around immediately and leave the area if that's what he preferred. Her years of outdoor experience had taught her that most encounters with unexpected individuals in remote areas could be resolved through respectful communication and a willingness to compromise. But the man's response made it clear that this wasn't a situation where compromise was possible. "Those permits mean nothing here," he continued. "Government papers don't give you the right to enter land that belongs to someone else. I've been living in this forest for 12 years, and I've established territorial control over everything from the ridge line to the east down to the river valley to the west. Every animal here knows me. Every trail here is mine, and every person who enters does so at my discretion." As he spoke, Sarah began to understand that the abandoned camping equipment she had been finding wasn't randomly left behind by forgetful hikers. This man had been systematically confiscating gear from visitors to his self-proclaimed territory, either through direct confrontation or by raiding campsites when occupants were away from their gear. The positioned backpack, the neatly placed boots, the fully set up but empty tent, these weren't signs of absent-minded campers, but evidence of forced evacuations. "I want you to leave everything except the clothes you're wearing," the man continued. "Your backpack, your camera equipment, your food supplies, all of that stays here. You can walk back the way you came. But you need to understand that if I ever see you in my territory again, the consequences will be much more serious than just losing your gear." Sarah realized that she was facing someone who had completely rejected society's rules and had created his own system of control in this remote area. The scattered equipment she had found along the trail represented years of encounters with hikers who had been forced to abandon their gear and flee the area. Some had apparently complied immediately and left with just their basic clothing. Others might have resisted and faced whatever more serious consequences this man was capable of implementing. The psychological impact of the encounter was intensified by the man's obvious competence in the wilderness environment. This wasn't a deranged individual making empty threats, but someone who clearly possessed the skills and knowledge to survive independently in harsh conditions, and who had established what he considered legitimate territorial control over a substantial area of public forest land. His calm demeanor and articulate speech made it clear that he was mentally capable of following through on his threats. Sarah made the decision to comply with his demands rather than risk escalation. She carefully removed her backpack and set it on the ground, followed by her camera bag and tripod. The man watched her actions closely, but made no move to approach or examine the equipment she was abandoning. When she had stripped down to just her basic hiking clothes and the water bottle she carried on her belt, he stepped aside and gestured for her to begin walking back toward the trailhead. The 6-mile hike back to her vehicle was one of the most psychologically challenging experiences of Sarah's outdoor career. Without her navigation equipment, she had to rely entirely on memory and natural landmarks to stay on the correct trail. She had no food supplies, limited water, and no emergency gear if weather conditions changed or if she became injured. But more disturbing than the physical challenges was the persistent feeling that she was being followed and observed during her entire retreat from the area. Several times during her hike out, Sarah heard sounds of movement in the forest, parallel to her position on the trail. Branches breaking, footsteps on fallen leaves, and other indications that someone or something was pacing her progress. She never saw direct evidence of being followed, but the psychological pressure of knowing that the territorial man was likely monitoring her departure added an element of terror to what should have been a routine hike. When Sarah reached her vehicle and drove to the nearest ranger station to report the encounter, she discovered that her experience wasn't unique. Park officials confirmed that they had received multiple reports over the past several years of encounters with an individual matching her description in that general area of the forest. However, the remote location and the fact that no actual physical violence had occurred made it difficult for law enforcement to take action. The man was technically trespassing on public land and engaging in theft by confiscating other people's property. But proving these crimes and locating a suspect who could disappear into thousands of acres of wilderness presented insurmountable challenges. The case of Sarah's encounter represents a disturbing reality about America's remote wilderness areas. They sometimes shelter individuals who have completely rejected civilized society and established their own rules and territorial boundaries. These modern wild men pose a unique threat to outdoor enthusiasts because they combine the survival skills necessary to thrive in harsh environments with a complete disregard for legal and social norms that govern civilized behavior. Unlike random criminals who might target campers, these territorial guardians view wilderness areas as their personal domains and feel justified in using whatever methods necessary to maintain control over their chosen territories. Let's move to our fourth story. There's something uniquely terrifying about being outnumbered in a remote location where screaming for help would only echo uselessly through empty wilderness. For David Chen, a 34-year-old software engineer from Portland who had taken up solo camping as a way to disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with nature, this terror became reality during what was supposed to be a peaceful 3-day retreat in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. David had been solo camping for about 2 years, gradually building his confidence and skills through carefully planned trips to increasingly remote locations. He prided himself on his methodical approach to wilderness safety, always filing detailed trip reports with friends, carrying emergency communication devices, and following established protocols for solo outdoor activities. The location David had chosen for his September 2020 camping trip was a dispersed camping area in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. accessed by a rough Forest Service road that required four-wheel drive and local knowledge to navigate successfully. He had discovered this particular spot through extensive research on camping forums and topographical map analysis, identifying an area that offered the solitude he craved while still being accessible enough for emergency evacuation if necessary. The site was situated on a small bluff overlooking a pristine alpine lake, surrounded by old-growth fir trees and offering spectacular views of distant mountain peaks. David arrived at his chosen campsite on Friday afternoon, October 2nd, after a challenging 2-hour drive on increasingly primitive forest roads. The isolation was exactly what he had been seeking. No cell phone coverage, no sounds of civilization, and no evidence that anyone else had camped in the area recently. He spent the remainder of daylight hours setting up his camp with the careful attention to detail that had become his routine. His tent was positioned to take advantage of morning sunlight while being protected from prevailing winds. His food was properly stored in bear-proof containers and hung at appropriate distances from his sleeping area. His campfire was built in an existing fire ring with proper clearance from flammable materials. As evening approached, David prepared a simple meal and settled in beside his campfire to enjoy the profound silence that only deep wilderness can provide. The lake below reflected the last light of sunset, creating a mirror image of the surrounding mountains that made the entire scene feel almost surreal in its beauty. He spent the evening reading by firelight, occasionally looking up to appreciate the brilliant display of stars that became visible as full darkness settled over the forest. By 10:30 p.m., he had banked his fire and retreated to his tent, feeling completely at peace with his decision to pursue solo camping despite the concerns expressed by friends and family. David woke naturally around 6 a.m. on Saturday morning, refreshed and eager to begin a day of hiking and photography in the surrounding area. As he emerged from his tent to rekindle his fire and prepare breakfast, he immediately noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. 4 men were sitting around what remained of his campfire, apparently having been there for some time based on their relaxed postures and the fact that they had rekindled the fire and were using it to heat what appeared to be coffee or tea in metal cups. The men looked up as David emerged from his tent, but their expressions showed no surprise or embarrassment at being discovered in his campsite. Instead, they regarded him with a casual interest that was somehow more disturbing than outright hostility would have been. They were all dressed in military-style clothing, not official uniforms, but the kind of surplus gear favored by survivalists and militia groups. Their ages appeared to range from late 20s to early 50s, and they all carried themselves with the confident bearing of people who were comfortable in wilderness environments and accustomed to operating as a coordinated group. "Morning," said the apparent leader of the group, a stocky man with graying hair and multiple visible tattoos on his arms. "Hope you don't mind us borrowing your fire. We've been hiking all night and needed a place to warm up and rest for a while." His tone was conversational, almost friendly, but there was an underlying implication that David's permission wasn't really being requested. It was simply being assumed. David attempted to maintain a calm and non-confrontational demeanor while assessing the situation. "No problem," he replied, though his mind was racing to understand why 4 men would be hiking through remote wilderness in the middle of the night, and how they had managed to locate his campsite in an area where navigation required significant skill and preparation. "Are you guys camping in the area too, or just passing through?" "Oh, we're definitely passing through," replied another member of the group, a younger man with a shaved head and what appeared to be military-style dog tags around his neck. "We've got places to be and things to take care of. But we noticed your nice setup here and thought we'd take a break before moving on." As he spoke, David noticed that all 4 men were carrying what appeared to be military-style backpacks, and that each had various pieces of equipment attached to their gear that looked more tactical than recreational. What happened next revealed the true nature of the situation David found himself in. While the leader continued making casual conversation, the other three men began systematically going through David's camping equipment and supplies. They weren't searching randomly or destructively, but methodically examining each item as if conducting an inventory. One man opened David's food containers and began distributing items among the group. Another went through his backpack, removing clothing and equipment and setting some items aside while discarding others. The third began dismantling his tent, apparently deciding which components were worth taking. "Hey, what are you doing?" David asked, trying to keep his voice calm, but finding it impossible to hide his growing alarm. "That's my gear. I need that equipment for my camping trip." He took a step toward the man who was handling his backpack, but the leader of the group immediately intervened. "I wouldn't worry too much about camping gear right now," the leader said, his tone remaining conversational but taking on a harder edge. "You're going to be coming on a little hike with us, and where we're going, you won't need most of this stuff." As he spoke, David noticed for the first time that the man had a large knife attached to his belt, and that his hand was resting casually on the handle. The realization hit David like a physical blow. These weren't random campers or even thieves looking to steal valuable equipment. This was a coordinated operation by people who had specifically targeted his isolated campsite and were planning to take him somewhere against his will. The methodical way they were sorting through his gear suggested they had experience with this type of situation and knew exactly what items would be useful for whatever they were planning. "Look, I don't know what you guys are planning, but I'm not going anywhere with you," David said, trying to inject authority into his voice despite the fear that was making his heart race. "I have people expecting me to check in, and if I don't contact them by tomorrow, they'll send search and rescue teams to look for me." This was partially true. He had left a general trip plan with friends, though the remote location and poor communication coverage meant that any rescue operation would take days to organize and execute. The leader smiled at David's statement, but it wasn't a reassuring expression. "That's exactly why we need to get moving," he said. "We've got a nice quiet place picked out where you can wait while we take care of some business. Nothing personal, you understand? You just happened to be camping in the wrong place at the wrong time." As he spoke, two of the other men moved to positions that effectively blocked David's potential escape routes, while the third continued packing selected items from David's gear into their own backpacks. David realized that his situation was rapidly deteriorating and that he needed to make a decision about how to respond. The men clearly had superior numbers, appeared to be experienced in outdoor environments, and were obviously prepared for the possibility that he might resist their plans. However, his knowledge of the local terrain and his desperation gave him advantages that they might not be expecting. Without warning, David suddenly sprinted toward the edge of the bluff, overlooking the lake. His sudden movement caught the group off guard, and he managed to cover about 20 yards before the nearest man could react. But instead of continuing toward the lake, David veered sharply to his left and plunged into the dense forest that surrounded the camping area. His years of hiking and trail running had given him the ability to move quickly through rough terrain, and his intimate familiarity with this particular area provided crucial advantages in navigating through the thick undergrowth. Behind him, he could hear the men shouting to each other and crashing through the forest in pursuit. Their tactical gear and heavy packs, which had seemed intimidating in the open camping area, now became liabilities that slowed their movement through dense vegetation and uneven terrain. David used every trick he had learned during his wilderness adventures, staying low to avoid branches, following game trails that were invisible to inexperienced eyes, and using the natural sound barriers provided by streams and rock formations to mask his movement. The chase continued for over an hour through increasingly difficult terrain. David's superior knowledge of the area allowed him to stay ahead of his pursuers, but he could hear them behind him, communicating through hand signals and tactical whispers that suggested military or law enforcement training. At several points, he heard voices coming from different directions, indicating that they had split up to try to surround him or cut off his escape routes. Eventually, David reached a section of the forest where a steep ravine created a natural barrier that would be extremely difficult for his pursuers to cross while maintaining their pursuit. He used this geographical advantage to put significant distance between himself and the group, eventually reaching a Forest Service road approximately 4 miles from his original campsite. A passing pickup truck, driven by local hunters, provided transportation back to the main highway, where David was able to contact law enforcement and report the incident. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing evidence that David's encounter wasn't an isolated incident. Forest Service officials and local law enforcement had received multiple reports over the previous year of suspicious activities in that general area, including reports of armed groups conducting what appeared to be training exercises on public land. However, the remote location and the transient nature of the groups made investigation and enforcement extremely difficult. When authorities returned to David's campsite the following day, they found evidence of the encounter, but no trace of the 4 men. His camping equipment had been completely removed, and the area had been cleaned so thoroughly that it appeared no one had ever camped there. The systematic nature of the cleanup suggested that the group was experienced in covering their tracks and eliminating evidence of their activities. David's case highlights a particularly disturbing trend in remote wilderness areas. The presence of organized groups that view isolated campers as potential targets for reasons that may go far beyond simple robbery. Whether motivated by extremist ideologies, criminal enterprises, or other factors, these groups represent a threat that most recreational campers never consider when planning their wilderness adventures. The coordination, equipment, and tactical awareness demonstrated by David's attackers suggest that they were part of a larger organization with specific objectives that required controlling or eliminating witnesses in remote areas. The psychological impact of David's encounter extended far beyond the immediate physical danger he faced. The realization that organized groups might be actively hunting isolated campers in areas that are supposed to represent safety and escape from urban dangers fundamentally changed his relationship with wilderness recreation. Despite his successful escape, the knowledge that such threats exist in remote areas continues to influence his camping decisions and has led him to abandon solo camping entirely in favor of group activities in more populated areas. This story serves as a stark reminder that the wilderness can harbor human predators who are far more dangerous than any natural threat. Unlike wild animals that typically avoid human contact, these organized groups actively seek out isolated victims in remote locations where help is far away and escape options are limited. The systematic nature of their operation and their obvious experience in wilderness environments make them a particularly formidable threat to solo campers who believe that isolation provides safety rather than vulnerability. Let's move to our 5th story. The methodical destruction of camping equipment by unseen attackers represents one of the most psychologically disturbing categories of wilderness encounters, where victims must helplessly listen as their survival gear is systematically demolished by people who remain hidden in the darkness. For Marcus Rodriguez, a 29-year-old forestry technician from Colorado who possessed extensive wilderness survival skills and years of backcountry experience, this nightmare scenario became reality during what was intended to be a peaceful solo retreat in the remote sections of the San Juan National Forest. Marcus had chosen wilderness camping not just as recreation, but as a professional development activity that kept his outdoor skills sharp and provided the kind of mental reset that his demanding job required. The location Marcus selected for his October 2021 camping trip was a high-altitude meadow accessible only by a challenging 8-mile hike through rugged mountain terrain. He had discovered this particular spot during his professional surveys of beetle-damaged timber stands. Noting its combination of natural beauty, reliable water sources, and the kind of complete isolation that made it perfect for extended solo camping. The meadow sat at approximately 9,200 feet elevation, surrounded by dense stands of aspen and pine trees that were beginning their spectacular autumn transformation. The nearest maintained trail was over 3 miles away, and the approach required advanced navigation skills and significant physical conditioning to complete successfully. Marcus began his hike on Thursday morning, October 14th, carrying a carefully planned selection of lightweight gear that would allow him to remain comfortable for 5 days in potentially harsh mountain weather. His professional background had taught him to prepare for rapid weather changes at high altitude, and his pack included redundant systems for shelter, fire starting, and emergency communication. He reached his intended campsite in the early afternoon, taking advantage of the remaining daylight hours to establish a secure camp that could withstand the strong winds and potential snowfall that October mountain weather could deliver with little warning. The setup process had become a practiced routine for Marcus over his years of professional and recreational camping. He selected a position for his hammock camping system that provided natural wind protection while maintaining access to the meadow's water source. His gear was organized with the methodical precision that his forestry work had ingrained as second nature, with emergency equipment positioned for quick access and valuable items secured against both weather and wildlife. As evening approached, Marcus prepared a warm meal and settled into his sleeping system, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from being completely self-sufficient in a beautiful and challenging environment. The first 3 nights of Marcus's camping trip passed without incident, filled with the kind of restoration and peace that had drawn him to solo wilderness camping. He spent his days exploring the surrounding terrain, documenting wildlife sign, and practicing the advanced outdoor skills that his profession required him to maintain. The complete absence of human presence and the stunning natural beauty of the high mountain environment provided exactly the kind of mental reset he had been seeking. Each evening, he enjoyed the simple pleasure of preparing his meal beside a small campfire while watching the sunset paint the surrounding peaks in brilliant colors. But on his 4th night, Sunday, October 17th, Marcus's peaceful retreat took a sinister turn that would forever change his perception of wilderness safety. He had retired to his hammock around 9:30 p.m., planning to wake early for his final day of camping before beginning the long hike back to civilization. The mountain night was crisp and clear, with brilliant stars visible through the forest canopy and the kind of profound silence that only high-altitude wilderness can provide. For the first few hours, everything seemed perfectly normal as Marcus dozed comfortably in his insulated sleeping system. Around 1:15 a.m., Marcus was awakened by the sound of something moving through his campsite. His first assumption was that a curious deer or elk had wandered into the meadow to investigate his presence, a common occurrence that he had experienced many times during his wilderness camping career. He lay still in his hammock, listening carefully to identify the source of the disturbance and determine whether any action was necessary to protect his food supplies from wildlife. But what he heard next made his blood run cold. Instead of the natural sounds of an animal moving through the forest, Marcus heard the unmistakable sound of his camping equipment being deliberately manipulated by human hands. Someone was going through his gear, but not in the hurried way of a thief looking for valuable items. These were the methodical, purposeful sounds of someone systematically examining each piece of his equipment. Marcus remained motionless in his hammock, trying to peer through the darkness to identify who was in his campsite and what they might be doing. The moon had set several hours earlier, leaving the forest in nearly complete darkness that made visual identification impossible. But the sounds continued, growing more disturbing as the unseen intruder began what appeared to be deliberate destruction of his carefully organized gear. The first item to be destroyed was his camp stove, which Marcus heard being deliberately disassembled and thrown against nearby trees. The metallic clanging and crashing sounds echoed through the forest as component parts scattered across the meadow. Next came his water filtration system, which he heard being smashed against rocks with repeated forceful impacts that left no doubt about the deliberate nature of the destruction. The systematic demolition continued as his backup equipment, emergency supplies, and even his spare clothing were subjected to methodical destruction by someone who remained completely invisible in the darkness. What made the experience particularly terrifying was the complete silence of the attacker between episodes of destruction. Marcus never heard footsteps, breathing, or any other sounds that would indicate the presence of a human being moving through his campsite. The destruction would occur in bursts of activity lasting several minutes, followed by periods of absolute silence that lasted 15 or 20 minutes. During these quiet intervals, Marcus strained to hear any indication of where the attacker might be positioned, or whether they were still present in the immediate area. After approximately an hour of intermittent destruction, Marcus heard voices for the first time. Multiple people were communicating in whispers so quiet that he couldn't make out specific words, but the tone and rhythm clearly indicated human conversation. The realization that he was facing multiple attackers rather than a single disturbed individual added another layer of terror to an already nightmare situation. The coordination required to maintain such systematic destruction while remaining virtually invisible suggested that this was an organized group with experience in this type of psychological warfare. The whispered conversations seemed to be followed by periods of intense activity where multiple pieces of equipment were destroyed simultaneously. Marcus heard his backup shelter being torn apart, his emergency communication devices being smashed against rocks, and his food supplies being scattered throughout the forest. The attackers seemed to know exactly what items were essential for wilderness survival, and were methodically eliminating his ability to remain in the backcountry or to call for emergency assistance. Around 3:30 a.m., the nature of the attack escalated in a way that made Marcus realize his life might be in immediate danger. The attackers began using what sounded like hatchets or similar tools to destroy larger pieces of equipment, creating loud crashing sounds that echoed off the surrounding mountains. But more disturbing were the comments he began to hear during these episodes of destruction. Voices that had previously been whispered were now speaking at normal volume, making statements clearly intended for Marcus to hear. "He's awake in there," said one voice. "He's been listening to everything we've been doing." Another voice responded, "Good. He needs to understand what happens to people who think they can just set up camp wherever they want." The conversation continued with references to territorial boundaries, outsider intrusion, and the need to send messages that would discourage other campers from accessing this area. Marcus realized that he was facing individuals who considered this remote mountain meadow to be their exclusive territory, and were using systematic equipment destruction and psychological intimidation to drive away anyone who attempted to camp in the area. The methodical nature of their attack and their obvious familiarity with wilderness environments suggested that this wasn't their first encounter with unsuspecting campers. As dawn began to break around 5:45 a.m., the attackers made their final and most disturbing statement. "You've got exactly 1 hour to get out of our territory," announced the apparent leader of the group. "Take whatever you can carry and start walking. If we see you in this area again, the consequences will be much more serious than just losing your camping gear." The tone carried the absolute certainty of people who had the means and willingness to follow through on their threats. When Marcus finally emerged from his hammock as full daylight illuminated the meadow, he discovered a scene of complete devastation. Every piece of his camping equipment had been destroyed beyond repair. His tent was shredded, his sleeping bag was torn apart and scattered, and his cooking equipment was smashed into unrecognizable fragments. Most seriously, his emergency communication devices and navigation equipment had been completely destroyed, leaving him without any means of calling for help or accurately determining his route back to civilization. The 8-mile hike back to his vehicle became a survival exercise rather than a routine conclusion to his camping trip. Without proper gear, adequate food supplies, or emergency communication capabilities, Marcus had to rely entirely on his professional wilderness skills and physical conditioning to reach safety. The psychological pressure of knowing that he was being watched and possibly followed by the group that had destroyed his equipment added another dimension of stress to what was already a challenging wilderness traverse. Marcus reported the incident to Forest Service law enforcement, but the remote location and lack of physical evidence made investigation extremely difficult. When authorities visited the campsite several days later, they found that the area had been completely cleaned of debris, with no evidence remaining of either Marcus's camping equipment or the presence of the attackers. The systematic cleanup suggested that the group was experienced in eliminating evidence of their activities and had probably conducted similar operations against other campers in the area. Investigation revealed that Marcus's experience wasn't unique. Forest Service officials had received scattered reports over the previous 2 years of camping equipment being mysteriously destroyed or vandalized in that general region of the San Juan National Forest. However, the remote locations and the reluctance of many victims to report incidents that they couldn't fully explain had prevented authorities from recognizing the pattern of organized territorial enforcement that Marcus's detailed account finally revealed. The case highlights a disturbing reality about America's most remote wilderness areas. They sometimes harbor individuals or groups who have established their own territorial boundaries and enforcement systems that operate completely outside legal authority. These modern-day wilderness vigilantes view isolated campers not as fellow outdoor enthusiasts exercising their legal rights to use public land, but as intruders who must be driven away through intimidation and equipment destruction. The psychological warfare techniques they employ, combined with their obvious wilderness survival skills, make them particularly effective at controlling access to remote areas without resorting to the kind of direct violence that would trigger intensive law enforcement investigation. For Marcus, the experience fundamentally changed his approach to wilderness camping and his perception of remote area safety. Despite his extensive professional experience and wilderness survival skills, the encounter demonstrated that even the most prepared and knowledgeable outdoor enthusiasts can find themselves completely vulnerable to organized groups that have rejected civilized rules of conduct and established their own systems of territorial control in America's most isolated wilderness areas. Let's move to our 6th story. When domestic violence spills over into public camping areas, it creates a uniquely terrifying situation for innocent bystanders who find themselves unwilling witnesses to escalating conflicts that can turn deadly without warning. For the Hartwell family, parents Janet and Robert with their 2 teenage children, Emma and Tyler, what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend at a popular family campground in Central Texas became a nightmarish ordeal that would test their judgment, courage, and survival instincts when they found themselves caught between an abusive relationship and what appeared to be organized criminal activity. The Hartwells had been regular visitors to Bastrop State Park for over 6 years, making it their preferred destination for monthly family camping trips that provided a much-needed break from their busy suburban lives in Austin. Robert worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, while Janet managed a local veterinary clinic, and both parents believed strongly in the importance of exposing their children to outdoor activities and family bonding time away from screens and social media. Their camping routine had become almost ritualistic. They always reserved the same cluster of campsites, brought the same menu of simple camping meals, and followed the same schedule of hiking, fishing, and evening campfire activities that had created some of their family's most cherished memories. On the weekend of November 6, 2021, the Hartwells arrived at Bastrop State Park on Friday evening to begin what they expected would be another peaceful family camping experience. They had reserved sites 23 and 24, which provided enough space for their large family tent and allowed the teenagers some privacy while maintaining parental supervision. The park was moderately busy for early November, with several other families and couples occupying nearby campsites, creating the kind of comfortable community atmosphere that the Hartwells had always appreciated about organized campgrounds. As they set up their camp on Friday evening, the family noticed that the campsite directly adjacent to theirs, Site 22, was occupied by what appeared to be a couple in their 30s. The man was stocky and heavily tattooed, with the kind of aggressive demeanor that immediately put Janet on edge, though she kept her concerns to herself rather than alarm the children. The woman appeared younger, maybe mid-20s, and seemed nervous and subdued in a way that suggested she was afraid of her companion. Their campsite was set up in a haphazard manner that contrasted sharply with the organized layouts of other family campers. And their conversation, when audible, consisted mainly of the man making demands and the woman offering apologetic responses. The first sign of serious trouble came around 10:30 p.m. on Friday night, as the Hartwells were settling into their sleeping arrangements and preparing for bed. The couple at Site 22 began having what started as a heated argument but quickly escalated into something much more serious. The man's voice became increasingly aggressive and threatening, while the woman's responses suggested genuine fear for her safety. Janet and Robert exchanged concerned looks, but the campground's family-friendly atmosphere and the presence of other campers nearby made it difficult to believe that any real danger could develop in such a public setting. But as the argument continued, it became clear that this wasn't a typical domestic dispute that would resolve itself quickly. The man began making specific threats against the woman's safety, using language that was not only verbally abusive, but contained detailed descriptions of physical violence he was planning to inflict. More disturbing were his references to people he claimed to be associated with. Individuals he described as cartel connections, who would help him handle problems if the woman didn't comply with his demands. Emma, the Hartwell's 16-year-old daughter, was the first family member to suggest that they should intervene or at least alert park authorities about the escalating situation. Her teenage sense of justice was outraged by what she was hearing, and she couldn't understand why the adults around her weren't taking immediate action to help someone who was obviously in danger. But Robert and Janet faced the complex moral and practical dilemma that confronts many people who witness domestic violence in public settings. The uncertainty about when intervention becomes necessary, and the real risk that getting involved could escalate the situation and endanger their own family. Around 11:45 p.m., the argument reached a level that eliminated any doubt about the seriousness of the threat. The sound of a physical altercation could be heard clearly from the neighboring campsite, including what sounded like furniture being overturned. The woman crying out in pain, and the man making explicit threats about what would happen if she tried to leave or call for help. Most chilling were his repeated references to weapons he claimed to have access to and his detailed knowledge of the campground layout, suggesting that he had been planning this confrontation for some time. Robert made the decision to quietly approach the camp host's site to report the disturbance. But when he reached the host station, he discovered that the volunteer camp hosts had already left for the evening and wouldn't return until morning. The campground's remote location meant that cell phone coverage was extremely limited. and the nearest law enforcement was over 20 miles away in the town of Bastrop. Even if he could get through to authorities, Robert realized that emergency response time would likely be 30 to 40 minutes. Far too long to help someone who might be in immediate physical danger. When Robert returned to his family's campsite, the situation at Site 22 had escalated further. The man was now speaking loudly, enough that his words were clearly audible to anyone within 100 yards. And his comments revealed disturbing details about his background and intentions. He claimed to be connected to Mexican cartel operations that used the Texas Hill Country for smuggling activities, and he made specific references to methods his associates used to deal with people who caused problems or knew too much. Whether these claims were true or simply the fantasies of an abusive individual trying to intimidate his victim, they created an atmosphere of genuine terror that affected everyone within hearing distance. The most disturbing aspect of the man's threats was his apparent awareness that other campers were listening to the confrontation. At several points, he made comments clearly directed toward the neighboring campsites, stating that anyone who interfered with his business or tried to help the woman would face serious consequences. He claimed to know which vehicles belonged to which campsites and made specific references to license plate numbers and family compositions that suggested he had been observing other campers throughout the day. Janet and Robert faced an impossible decision. Their parental instincts demanded that they protect their children from exposure to violence and potential danger. But their moral consciences couldn't ignore the fact that a woman in the next campsite was clearly in immediate physical danger. The man's claims about cartel connections and weapons access added a layer of uncertainty that made any intervention potentially life-threatening, not just for the Hartwells, but for the woman they would be trying to help. Around 1:30 a.m., the confrontation took another disturbing turn when the man began making phone calls to what he claimed were his business associates. The conversations, conducted loudly enough to be clearly overheard, involved discussions about handling a situation and cleaning up a problem at the campground. He provided detailed directions to their campsite location and made references to additional work that might need to be done if too many people had witnessed the evening's events. The Hartwell children, despite their parents' attempts to shield them from the worst of the situation, were fully aware that something serious was happening. Tyler, their 14-year-old son, had quietly retrieved his father's camping knife and positioned himself near the tent entrance, while Emma had prepared a small bag with essential items in case the family needed to evacuate quickly. The teenagers' instinctive preparation for potential danger reflected the gravity of the situation and the very real possibility that violence could spill over into neighboring campsites. The psychological pressure of listening to detailed threats while being unable to take meaningful action created an atmosphere of helpless terror that would haunt the Hartwell family long after the immediate danger had passed. They spent the remainder of the night taking turns maintaining watch, monitoring the situation at Site 22, and preparing for the possibility that they might need to flee the campground on foot if the violence escalated to the point where their vehicle might be compromised or blocked. As dawn approached around 6:30 a.m., the immediate crisis appeared to subside. The man's threatening behavior diminished, and the woman's cries for help became less frequent. But rather than providing relief, the sudden quiet created new fears about what might have happened to the victim and whether the threatened associates might arrive during daylight hours to clean up the situation. The Hartwells maintained their vigilant watch throughout the early morning hours, afraid to pack up their campsite in a way that might draw attention from the neighboring site. When park authorities finally arrived around 8 a.m. in response to reports from other campers, they found that Site 22 had been completely abandoned. The couple and all their equipment had vanished without a trace, leaving only scattered debris and evidence of the previous night's confrontation. Law enforcement officers who responded to investigate the scene found blood evidence and signs of a violent struggle, but no indication of where the couple had gone or whether the woman was still alive. The investigation that followed revealed that the license plate number associated with Site 22 belonged to a vehicle that had been reported stolen 3 days earlier from San Antonio. The man's identity remained unknown, and despite extensive investigation by both local law enforcement and federal agencies concerned about the cartel connection claims, no trace of either individual was ever found. The case remains open and unsolved, leaving the Hartwell family and other witnesses to wonder whether they witnessed a murder, a kidnapping, or simply an elaborate intimidation scheme designed to terrorize anyone who might consider interfering with criminal activities. The psychological impact on the Hartwell family extended far beyond the immediate terror of that night. The realization that they had been completely helpless to assist someone who was clearly in mortal danger, combined with the ongoing uncertainty about the victim's fate, created lasting trauma that affected their relationship with outdoor recreation and their sense of safety in public spaces. The children struggled with guilt about not doing more to help, while the parents grappled with the moral complexity of prioritizing their family's safety over their responsibility to assist someone in danger. Most disturbing was the knowledge that organized criminal activity could infiltrate even the most innocent and family-friendly outdoor environments. The campground that had provided years of peaceful family memories had been revealed as a potential staging area for violence and criminal activity that operated completely outside the safety nets that most families take for granted when visiting established recreational facilities. This case highlights the vulnerability of families who find themselves unwilling witnesses to domestic violence that may be connected to larger criminal enterprises. Unlike isolated camping encounters with disturbed individuals, this situation involved organized criminal activity that specifically used public campgrounds as venues for violence and intimidation. The combination of domestic abuse with cartel-style threats created a level of danger that typical family campers are completely unprepared to handle, demonstrating how quickly a routine family camping trip can become a survival situation when criminal activity invades spaces that are supposed to represent safety and recreation. For families who continue to enjoy campground-based recreation, the Hartwell's experience serves as a stark reminder that organized criminal activity can occur anywhere, and that the community atmosphere of family campgrounds can provide cover for dangerous individuals who deliberately choose public venues for their violent activities, knowing that witnesses will be too afraid or too concerned about their own family's safety to interfere effectively. Let's move to our seventh story. There are few things more unnerving than realizing that the sounds you've been hearing throughout the night aren't what they appear to be, especially when the deception involves someone deliberately mimicking animal calls to mask their human presence. For the Morrison family, husband and wife team of wildlife researchers Dr. Patricia Morrison and Dr. James Morrison, along with their 19-year-old son Kevin, who was studying environmental science, this terrifying discovery would turn a routine family research expedition into a psychological nightmare that challenged everything they thought they knew about wilderness safety and predator behavior. The Morrisons had been conducting collaborative wildlife research for over 15 years, combining Patricia's expertise in mammalian behavior with James's specialization in ecosystem dynamics to produce peer-reviewed studies that had earned them recognition in academic circles nationwide. Their research often required extended camping trips in remote locations where they could observe animal behavior without the interference of human activity, and they had developed sophisticated protocols for maintaining scientific objectivity while ensuring family safety during these expeditions. Kevin had been participating in these research trips since childhood, and at 19, he possessed wilderness skills and scientific knowledge that exceeded most professional outdoor guides. In late September 2019, The Morrison family had obtained permits to conduct a week-long behavioral study in a remote section of the Gila National Forest in New Mexico, focusing on the nocturnal activity patterns of local coyote populations. Their research required them to establish a base camp in an area known for high coyote density, while maintaining enough distance from human activity to ensure that their presence wouldn't significantly alter the natural behavior patterns they intended to document. The location they selected was accessible only by a challenging 12-mile hike through rugged desert terrain, and it offered the kind of complete isolation that serious wildlife research demanded. The family established their research camp on Sunday, September 22nd, setting up their equipment with the methodical precision that years of field research had taught them. Their campsite included not only personal shelter and supplies, but also sophisticated audio recording equipment, motion-activated cameras, and night vision observation tools that would allow them to document coyote behavior without direct interference. Patricia and James had conducted similar studies in various locations throughout the southwestern United States, and they approached this project with the confidence that came from extensive experience in remote wildlife research. The first 2 nights of their research expedition proceeded exactly as expected. The local coyote population was active and vocal, providing excellent opportunities for the behavioral documentation that formed the core of their study. The family recorded extensive audio samples of coyote vocalizations, documented pack movement patterns using their camera equipment, and observed feeding behaviors that confirmed many of their preliminary hypotheses about desert ecosystem dynamics. Kevin proved to be an invaluable research assistant, demonstrating both the technical skills and scientific insight that suggested a promising future in wildlife research. But on their 3rd night, Tuesday, September 24th, Patricia began to notice subtle irregularities in the coyote vocalizations they were recording. As someone who had spent decades studying mammalian communication patterns, she possessed an almost intuitive ability to distinguish between different types of animal calls and the emotional states they represented. The coyote sounds they were hearing seemed to follow normal patterns during the early evening hours. But as the night progressed, some of the calls began to display characteristics that didn't quite match authentic coyote vocalizations. Initially, Patricia attributed these irregularities to environmental factors that might be affecting the acoustic quality of their recordings. Desert terrain can create unusual sound reflections and distortions that can make familiar animal calls seem strange or artificial. However, as she listened more carefully to the real-time audio through her professional monitoring equipment, she began to identify specific vocal patterns that strongly suggested human mimicry rather than authentic animal communication. The first clear indication that something was seriously wrong came around 2:30 a.m., when Patricia detected a coyote call that included what sounded like a brief human cough in the middle of the vocalization. She immediately alerted James and Kevin, and the family began monitoring their audio equipment more intensively, focusing specifically on identifying any additional evidence of human presence disguised as animal activity. What they discovered over the next hour was deeply disturbing. A significant percentage of the coyote calls they had been hearing throughout the night were actually human vocalizations designed to mimic authentic animal sounds. The quality of the mimicry was sophisticated enough that it had initially fooled professional wildlife researchers who were specifically listening for coyote vocalizations. This suggested that whoever was producing these fake animal calls had extensive experience with coyote behavior and had practiced their imitation skills to a level that could deceive even trained scientists. The implications of this deception were terrifying. Someone was using animal call mimicry to mask their presence while conducting surveillance or stalking activities around the Morrison family's isolated research camp. As the family continued their intensive audio monitoring, they began to identify additional evidence of human presence disguised as natural animal activity. Some of the calls were coming from locations that shifted too rapidly for actual coyote movement patterns, suggesting that multiple people were positioned around their campsite and were coordinating their fake vocalizations. Other calls included subtle variations in pitch and rhythm that reflected human vocal limitations rather than the natural range of coyote communication. Most disturbing was the realization that the fake calls were specifically designed to surround their campsite with what appeared to be normal coyote activity. The positioning and timing of the vocalizations created an audio environment that would mask the approach of additional people, while making the family believe they were simply surrounded by a large and active coyote pack. Anyone listening casually would assume they were experiencing exactly the kind of wildlife activity that their research expedition was designed to study. Around 4 a.m., Kevin made a discovery that confirmed their worst fears about the situation they were facing. While using their night vision equipment to scan the perimeter of their campsite, he spotted a human figure positioned approximately 60 yards away in a location where several of the fake coyote calls had originated. The figure was crouched behind a large boulder in a position that provided clear surveillance of their camp, while offering concealment from casual observation. When Kevin adjusted the night vision scope to examine the area more carefully, he identified at least 3 additional human figures positioned at different points around their campsite. The Morrison family found themselves in a nightmare scenario where professional wildlife researchers were being stalked by people who possessed sophisticated knowledge of animal behavior and had invested significant time and effort in developing the skills necessary to deceive scientific experts. The level of preparation and coordination required for this type of operation suggested that they were facing individuals with extensive wilderness experience and possibly professional training in surveillance and infiltration techniques. James made the decision to wake Patricia and Kevin quietly and inform them of their situation without making any obvious changes to their behavior that might alert the watchers to their awareness. The family faced a complex strategic challenge. They needed to plan their response carefully while maintaining the appearance of normal camping activity to avoid escalating the situation. Their isolation meant that any call for help would take hours to result in emergency response, and their wilderness location offered numerous advantages to attackers who were familiar with the terrain. The psychological pressure of maintaining normal behavior while knowing they were surrounded by hidden watchers created an almost unbearable tension that tested the family's ability to think clearly and plan effectively. Every sound they made, every movement around their campsite, and every piece of equipment they used had to appear completely natural while they simultaneously developed an escape strategy that could succeed against multiple experienced opponents who had chosen the time, place, and circumstances for this confrontation. As dawn approached around 6:15 a.m., the fake coyote calls gradually diminished and eventually stopped completely. But rather than providing relief, the sudden silence created new concerns about what the watchers might be planning for daylight hours. The Morrison family used the early morning hours to quietly pack their essential research equipment and prepare for a rapid evacuation from their campsite, while maintaining the appearance of normal morning research activities. When they finally made their move around 8:30 a.m., the family discovered evidence that confirmed the systematic nature of the surveillance they had been subjected to. Footprints in the sandy soil around their campsite revealed that multiple people had approached to within 20 feet of their tent during the night, moving in patterns that suggested professional reconnaissance rather than random prowling. The tracks indicated that at least 4 individuals had been involved in the operation, and the depth and spacing of the footprints suggested people who were carrying significant equipment and were comfortable moving silently through difficult terrain. Most disturbing were the discovery of several small piles of sand that had been arranged in specific patterns near their campsite. These arrangements appeared to be some kind of marker system that might have been used to coordinate the positions and movements of the surveillance team throughout the night. The systematic nature of these markers suggested that the operation had been planned in advance, and that the Morrison family had been specifically targeted rather than randomly encountered. The 12-mile hike back to their vehicle became a survival exercise, where the family had to maintain constant vigilance for signs of continued surveillance, while covering challenging terrain as quickly as possible. Their scientific equipment, which had been essential for their research, now became a burden that slowed their evacuation and made them more visible to potential pursuers. The psychological stress of not knowing whether they were still being followed or watched made every mile of the return journey feel like a test of endurance and courage. When the Morrison family reached their vehicle and drove to the nearest law enforcement agency to report the incident, they discovered that their experience wasn't unprecedented in that area of the Gila National Forest. Forest Service officials had received scattered reports over the previous year of wildlife researchers and serious campers reporting unusual animal call patterns and evidence of human surveillance in remote areas. However, the sophisticated nature of the animal call mimicry and the professional-level surveillance techniques described by the Morrisons represented an escalation in both the skill level and coordination of these activities. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing evidence that organized groups were using advanced wilderness skills to conduct surveillance and intimidation operations against researchers and campers in remote areas. The animal call mimicry technique demonstrated a level of sophistication that suggested either professional training or extensive experience in wilderness infiltration. The coordination required to maintain the deception throughout an entire night while positioning multiple people around a target campsite indicated that this was an organized operation rather than the work of individual disturbed persons. For the Morrison family, the experience fundamentally changed their approach to field research and their perception of wilderness safety. Despite their extensive professional experience and scientific expertise, they had been completely vulnerable to surveillance techniques that exploited their expectations about natural animal behavior. The realization that their scientific knowledge could be used against them by people who understood how researchers think and behave added a layer of personal violation to the immediate physical danger they had faced. The case highlights how organized groups can exploit the expectations and expertise of their victims to conduct more effective stalking and surveillance operations. By using sophisticated animal call mimicry, the attackers were able to hide their presence in plain sight, knowing that wildlife researchers would interpret the sounds as normal animal activity, rather than the evidence of human surveillance. This technique represents a particularly insidious form of psychological warfare that turns victims' professional knowledge and wilderness experience into vulnerabilities that can be exploited by determined predators. The incident also demonstrates the vulnerability of even highly experienced outdoor professionals when they encounter organized opposition that has invested time and resources in developing specialized skills for wilderness operations. The Morrison family's scientific training and wilderness experience, which had protected them during years of remote research, proved insufficient against attackers who had specifically developed techniques to exploit the behavior patterns and expectations of their intended victims. This story serves as a warning that the wilderness can harbor individuals or groups who possess sophisticated knowledge of both animal behavior and human psychology, and who use this knowledge to conduct surveillance and intimidation operations that can deceive even professional wildlife researchers. The combination of advanced wilderness skills with apparent criminal intent creates a particularly dangerous threat that operates completely outside the safety assumptions that guide most legitimate outdoor activities. For anyone conducting research or camping in remote areas, the Morrison family's experience demonstrates that even the most familiar animal sounds might not be what they appear to be. and that professional expertise can sometimes become a liability when facing adversaries who understand how to exploit specialized knowledge and expectations. Let's move to our eighth story. Sometimes, the most devastating wilderness emergencies are caused not by natural disasters or animal attacks, but by human-made traps that have been deliberately hidden in popular hiking areas to maim or kill unsuspecting outdoor enthusiasts. For Rachel Thompson, a 26-year-old emergency room nurse from Denver who had taken up serious backpacking as a way to cope with the stress of her demanding medical career, this horrific reality became apparent during what was supposed to be a therapeutic solo hiking trip in the remote backcountry of Rocky Mountain National Park. Rachel's medical training, which she had hoped would never be needed during her recreational activities, would prove to be the only thing standing between her hiking companion and a gruesome death in one of Colorado's most beautiful wilderness areas. Rachel had planned this particular backpacking expedition as part of a larger group trip organized through a Denver-based hiking club that specialized in challenging backcountry routes for experienced outdoor enthusiasts. The group consisted of 8 members with varying levels of wilderness experience, but all had completed the club's safety training and possessed the physical conditioning necessary for multi-day expeditions in high-altitude environments. Their planned route would take them through some of the most remote and spectacular terrain in Rocky Mountain National Park, following unmarked trails that required advanced navigation skills and offered the kind of solitude that serious hikers sought to escape the crowds that filled more popular park destinations. The group had been hiking together for 2 days when they reached a particularly scenic area near Tree Line, where vast alpine meadows offered panoramic views of the surrounding peaks and valleys. This section of their route was known among experienced hikers as one of the most beautiful wilderness areas accessible by foot in Colorado. Combining stunning natural beauty with the challenge of high-altitude hiking that tested both physical conditioning and wilderness survival skills, the group had established their camp in a protected valley that provided natural wind shelter while maintaining access to reliable water sources and the kind of dramatic mountain scenery that made the challenging hike worthwhile. On the morning of July 18, 2022, Rachel and her hiking partner, Mike Chen, a 31-year-old software engineer who had become her closest friend in the hiking club, decided to explore a side trail that led to what their topographical maps indicated was a hidden waterfall approximately 2 miles from their base camp. The other group members chose to spend the day resting and preparing for the next day's challenging ascent to a high mountain pass, leaving Rachel and Mike to pursue their more ambitious exploration plans. Both hikers were experienced in off-trail navigation and carried the emergency equipment necessary for safe backcountry travel, including first aid supplies, emergency communication devices, and the knowledge necessary to handle typical wilderness emergencies. The trail to the waterfall was unmarked and required careful attention to subtle terrain features and occasional cairns left by previous hikers to maintain proper direction. Rachel and Mike had been hiking for approximately 90 minutes through increasingly beautiful but challenging terrain when they reached what appeared to be a natural resting spot beside a small alpine stream. The location was perfect for a break. Clear mountain water, comfortable seating on sun-warmed rocks, and spectacular views of the surrounding peaks that made the challenging hike seem worthwhile. Mike stepped forward to refill his water bottles at the stream, choosing what appeared to be a safe and stable position on the rocky bank, where clear water flowed over a series of natural stone steps. But as he placed his weight on what looked like solid ground, his left leg suddenly plunged through what had appeared to be normal forest floor, and the peaceful mountain morning was shattered by his screams of agony. Hidden beneath a carefully camouflaged covering of natural vegetation and forest debris was a steel bear trap that had been deliberately placed in a location where hikers would naturally stop to access the water source. The trap's massive steel jaws, designed to hold animals weighing several hundred pounds, closed with crushing force around Mike's leg just above the ankle. The impact was so severe that Rachel initially thought she was witnessing a fatal injury. The steel teeth penetrated completely through his hiking boot and deep into the flesh and bone of his lower leg, creating massive trauma that began bleeding profusely immediately. Mike's screams echoed off the surrounding mountains, and the sight of the massive steel trap protruding from his leg created a scene of horror that seemed impossible in such a beautiful, natural setting. Rachel's medical training kicked in immediately, overriding the shock and horror of witnessing her friend's catastrophic injury. As an emergency room nurse, she had treated countless trauma victims, but never under conditions where she was the only medical professional available and where emergency transportation was impossible. She quickly assessed Mike's condition, recognizing that the severe bleeding and potential arterial damage could result in death within minutes if she couldn't control the hemorrhaging and manage his traumatic shock. The bear trap itself presented a complex medical and mechanical challenge that Rachel had never encountered in her hospital experience. The device was designed to hold struggling animals through massive crushing force, and its release mechanism was not immediately apparent. Mike's leg was trapped between steel jaws that were applying constant pressure to his injured tissues, potentially causing additional damage with every movement. Rachel realized that her first priority had to be stopping the bleeding and preventing shock, but that accomplishing these goals would be nearly impossible while the trap remained attached to his leg. Using every piece of first aid equipment she carried, Rachel worked frantically to control Mike's bleeding while searching for a way to release the trap mechanism. The device was old but well maintained, suggesting that it had been placed deliberately by someone with experience in animal trapping who knew how to position and camouflage the trap for maximum effectiveness. The location beside the water source was particularly diabolical, as it targeted the natural behavior of hikers who would inevitably need to access the stream for drinking water or equipment cleaning. As Rachel worked to stabilize Mike's condition, she made the horrifying discovery that this wasn't an isolated trap. While searching the immediate area for materials she could use to create pressure bandages and splinting, she found evidence of at least 3 additional bear traps that had been concealed along what appeared to be the natural approach routes to the water source. Each trap was positioned to target different aspects of normal hiker behavior. One near a fallen log that provided natural seating, another beside a flat rock that would appeal to hikers looking for a place to rest their backpacks, and a third hidden in the vegetation near what appeared to be a natural bathroom area. The systematic placement of multiple traps suggested that this wasn't the work of a careless or inexperienced individual, but rather a deliberate operation designed to inflict maximum casualties on hiking groups that used this area. The camouflage techniques were sophisticated enough to fool experienced hikers who were specifically looking for hazards, and the positioning demonstrated intimate knowledge of hiker behavior patterns and the terrain features that would naturally attract people to specific locations. Mike's condition was deteriorating rapidly, despite Rachel's emergency medical intervention. The crushing trauma from the bear trap had damaged blood vessels, nerves, and bone structures in ways that required immediate surgical intervention that was impossible to provide in their remote wilderness location. Rachel faced the agonizing decision of whether to attempt releasing the trap mechanism herself, risking additional damage to Mike's already catastrophic injuries, or to maintain his current stabilization while somehow getting him evacuated to definitive medical care. The trap's release mechanism proved to be deliberately designed to prevent easy removal by the trapped victim or rescuers. Unlike commercial traps that included safety releases for accidental human contact, this device appeared to have been modified to make escape nearly impossible without specific tools and knowledge. Rachel eventually discovered that the release required simultaneous pressure on 2 concealed trigger points while applying leverage with a tool strong enough to overcome the spring tension that kept the jaws closed. Using her hiking poles and the mechanical advantage provided by a nearby fallen tree, Rachel was finally able to release the trap, after nearly 40 minutes of desperate effort. But the additional time required for trap removal had allowed Mike's condition to deteriorate to the point where he was drifting in and out of consciousness from blood loss and traumatic shock. His leg, now freed from the steel jaws, revealed the extent of damage that the trap had inflicted. Crushed bone, severed tendons, and deep lacerations that continued bleeding despite Rachel's best efforts at emergency field treatment. The evacuation process required Rachel to make a series of life-or-death decisions about Mike's treatment, while simultaneously navigating the complex logistics of emergency rescue in remote wilderness terrain. She used her emergency communication device to contact park rescue services. But the mountainous terrain and distance from civilization meant that helicopter evacuation would require several hours to organize and execute. Mike's injuries were severe enough that he might not survive the time required for professional rescue to reach their location. Rachel made the crucial decision to begin moving Mike toward a location where helicopter evacuation would be possible, despite the risk that movement might worsen his injuries. Using improvised materials and her medical knowledge, she created a splinting and transport system that would allow her to move him gradually down the mountain while maintaining some protection for his damaged leg. The process required her to essentially perform field surgery while managing the complex logistics of wilderness evacuation. The descent took over 6 hours of continuous effort, with Rachel stopping frequently to reassess Mike's condition and adjust his emergency medical treatment. Several times during the evacuation, his vital signs deteriorated to the point where she believed he was dying. But her persistent medical intervention and determination kept him stable enough to continue toward rescue. The combination of high-altitude conditions, difficult terrain, and the constant stress of managing a critically injured patient tested Rachel's physical and emotional limits beyond anything she had experienced in her professional medical career. When the park rescue helicopter finally reached them at a location where evacuation was possible, Mike was barely conscious and had lost a dangerous amount of blood. The professional emergency medical team that took over his care confirmed that Rachel's field treatment had almost certainly saved his life, but noted that his injuries were so severe that permanent disability was inevitable. The bear trap had caused damage to bone, muscle, nerve, and vascular structures that would require multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation to restore even partial function to his leg. The investigation that followed revealed that the trap placement was part of a larger pattern of similar devices that had been found in various wilderness areas throughout Colorado and neighboring states. Law enforcement officials discovered evidence of an organized effort to place concealed traps in popular hiking areas, apparently motivated by anti-government ideology and hatred of federal land use policies. The individuals responsible viewed outdoor recreationists as symbols of government overreach and had chosen to express their extremist beliefs through terrorist attacks designed to maim and kill innocent hikers. The sophisticated nature of the trap placement and camouflage suggested that the perpetrators possessed extensive knowledge of both wilderness areas and hiker behavior patterns. They had invested significant time and resources in developing techniques that could consistently fool experienced outdoor enthusiasts. And they had chosen locations that would maximize casualties while minimizing the risk of detection by law enforcement. The systematic nature of their operation indicated that multiple individuals were involved, and that they had been conducting their terrorist activities for an extended period. For Rachel, the experience fundamentally changed her relationship with wilderness recreation and her understanding of the threats that outdoor enthusiasts might face in remote areas. Despite her medical training and wilderness experience, she had been completely unprepared for the deliberate human malice that could transform beautiful natural areas into deadly traps. The realization that organized groups were actively working to harm innocent hikers challenged her basic assumptions about wilderness safety and the motivations of people who might be encountered in remote areas. Mike's injuries ended his hiking career and required over 2 years of medical treatment and rehabilitation. The physical trauma was compounded by psychological effects that made it impossible for him to return to wilderness environments where similar threats might exist. His experience serves as a stark reminder that the wilderness can harbor not just natural hazards, but deliberate human threats that are designed specifically to exploit the trust and vulnerability of people who seek peace and recreation in remote natural areas. The case highlights a particularly insidious category of wilderness terrorism, where extremist individuals use their knowledge of outdoor recreation patterns to target innocent people who represent ideologies or government policies they oppose. Unlike random violence or criminal activity motivated by profit, these trap placements represent calculated attacks designed to send political messages through the maiming and killing of recreational users of public lands. The sophisticated planning and execution required for these operations demonstrate that wilderness terrorism can be carried out by individuals with advanced technical skills and intimate knowledge of both natural environments and human behavior patterns. For anyone engaging in wilderness recreation, this story demonstrates that even the most beautiful and apparently safe natural areas can harbor deadly threats that have been deliberately created by people who view outdoor enthusiasts as legitimate targets for terrorist attacks. The systematic nature of these trap placements and the sophisticated techniques used to conceal them suggest that this threat will continue to evolve as extremist groups develop new methods for attacking the public use of federal lands and wilderness areas. Let's move to our 9th story. Sometimes the most terrifying wilderness encounters involve the deliberate weaponization of natural disasters by human predators who use environmental catastrophes as hunting tools to trap and eliminate their victims. For the Patterson Camping Group, a collection of 6 experienced outdoor enthusiasts from Phoenix who had been camping together for over 8 years, this nightmare scenario became reality when they discovered that the approaching wildfire threatening their remote campsite wasn't entirely natural, but was being systematically guided and controlled by armed individuals who were using the flames as a herding mechanism to drive campers into predetermined kill zones. The Patterson Group consisted of longtime friends who had met through their shared passion for challenging wilderness adventures that took them far beyond the typical camping experiences available in Arizona's established campgrounds. The group included Marcus Patterson, a 42-year-old construction contractor who served as the informal leader. His wife Sarah, a 38-year-old paramedic, whose medical training made her invaluable during wilderness emergencies. Childhood friends Dave Romano and Tyler Wells, both in their early 40s and experienced in desert survival techniques. And the youngest members, Jessica Chen and her boyfriend Alex Murphy, both 29-year-old teachers who had been camping with the group for 3 years. Their August 2023 expedition had taken them to a particularly remote section of the Coconino National Forest in northern Arizona, where high-altitude pine forests provided a dramatic contrast to the desert landscapes that dominated their usual camping destinations. The area they had chosen required a challenging 8-mile hike through difficult terrain to reach a secluded valley that offered spectacular views, reliable water sources, and the complete isolation from human activity that their group preferred. The location had been recommended by other serious campers as one of the most beautiful and peaceful wilderness areas accessible to those willing to make the physical effort required to reach it. The group had established their base camp on Thursday, August 17th, setting up their equipment with the methodical precision that years of wilderness camping had taught them. Their campsite was positioned strategically to take advantage of natural wind protection while maintaining access to a clear mountain stream that provided fresh water and served as a natural fire break in case of wildfire danger. Arizona's summer fire season was always a concern for wilderness campers, But the group had checked current fire conditions with Forest Service authorities and had received assurance that no significant fire activity was expected in their planned camping area. The first 3 days of their camping trip proceeded exactly as planned, with the group enjoying perfect weather, spectacular hiking opportunities, and the kind of peaceful wilderness experience that had brought them together as friends over the years. They spent their days exploring the surrounding terrain, documenting wildlife sightings, and simply enjoying the profound quiet that only deep wilderness could provide. Each evening brought campfire conversations and the comfortable camaraderie that had developed through years of shared outdoor adventures. But on Sunday morning, August 20th, the group woke to the unmistakable smell of smoke drifting through their mountain valley. Forest fires were a constant concern during Arizona's dry season, and experienced wilderness campers like the Patterson Group maintained constant awareness of weather conditions and potential fire dangers. Sarah, whose paramedic training included wilderness emergency response, immediately began assessing wind patterns and smoke density to determine the direction and approximate distance of the fire source. What they discovered was deeply troubling. The smoke appeared to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting either multiple separate fire starts or a single large fire that had spread in an unusual pattern. More concerning was the rapid intensification of the smoke smell and the visible haze that began filtering the morning sunlight, indicating that whatever fire was producing, the smoke was moving toward their location much faster than would be expected from natural wildfire spread patterns. Marcus made the decision to break camp immediately and begin evacuation toward their vehicles, following established wilderness safety protocols for wildfire encounters. But as the group packed their equipment and prepared to leave their campsite, they began noticing disturbing evidence that this wasn't a typical natural disaster scenario. The smoke patterns were too systematic, and the fire appeared to be advancing along specific corridors that seemed designed to funnel people toward particular geographic features rather than spreading in the random patterns typical of wind-driven wildfires. As they began their evacuation hike, the group encountered the first direct evidence that human activity was involved in the fire's behavior. Dave, who was serving as the group's advance scout, discovered what appeared to be deliberately set fire lines that had been established to channel the main fire's advance in specific directions. These weren't the fire breaks typically created by professional firefighters to contain blazes, but rather accelerant trails designed to guide and intensify fire spread toward particular target areas. The realization that they were facing an artificially controlled fire created a level of terror that went far beyond normal wildfire evacuation procedures. Natural disasters, however dangerous, follow predictable patterns that experienced wilderness campers can anticipate and respond to appropriately. But fires that were being deliberately manipulated by unknown individuals represented a threat that was impossible to predict or counter using standard emergency response techniques. As the Patterson Group continued their evacuation, they began encountering additional evidence of human involvement in the fire's behavior. Jessica, who was hiking near the rear of the group, spotted what appeared to be people moving through the forest parallel to their evacuation route. The figures were too distant to identify clearly, but their movement patterns suggested coordination and purpose, rather than the random behavior of other evacuees fleeing the approaching flames. More disturbing were the sounds the group began hearing as they moved through the forest. Voices calling to each other in what appeared to be coordinated communication. Mechanical sounds that suggested equipment being operated, and other indications that organized human activity was taking place in areas where the fire should have made human presence impossible. The voices were too distant to understand specific words, but the tone and rhythm clearly indicated people who were working together on some kind of coordinated operation. Around 2:30 p.m., as the group was making good progress toward their planned evacuation route, They encountered Tyler Wells returning from a forward reconnaissance mission with information that transformed their understanding of the situation they were facing. Tyler had discovered that their primary evacuation route, the trail they had used to access their camping area, was completely blocked by fire that appeared to have been deliberately set to prevent people from leaving the area by their most obvious escape route. But more terrifying than the blocked escape route was Tyler's discovery of armed individuals who were positioned along alternative evacuation corridors. He had observed at least 4 people carrying what appeared to be military-style rifles who were stationed at strategic points where fleeing campers would naturally attempt to exit the fire area. Their positioning and equipment suggested that they were specifically prepared to intercept anyone trying to escape the approaching flames. The Patterson group found themselves in a nightmare scenario where environmental disaster was being used as a weapon by unknown attackers who had established armed positions to prevent their targets from reaching safety. The systematic nature of the operation suggested extensive planning and coordination, indicating that multiple people with significant resources and wilderness expertise were involved in what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to trap and kill campers in the remote forest area. Sarah's medical training and emergency response experience helped the group analyze their situation and develop survival strategies that went beyond normal wildfire evacuation procedures. They were facing not just environmental danger from the approaching fire, but coordinated human opposition that was specifically designed to prevent their escape. The combination of natural disaster with armed human predators created a tactical situation that required military-style thinking rather than conventional wilderness survival techniques. The group made the decision to abandon their planned evacuation routes and instead attempt to reach safety by traveling cross-country through terrain that would be difficult for their armed pursuers to monitor or control. This decision required them to move through areas where the fire danger was higher, but where they would be less likely to encounter the human threats that had been positioned along established trails and natural travel corridors. The cross-country evacuation became a survival exercise that combined wilderness navigation skills with tactical awareness and evasion techniques that none of the group members had ever expected to need during recreational camping. They had to move quickly enough to stay ahead of the advancing fire, while remaining quiet enough to avoid detection by the armed individuals who were clearly searching for evacuees throughout the forest area. During their evasion movement, the group discovered additional evidence of the systematic nature of the operation they were facing. Marcus found what appeared to be a coordination station, where maps had been posted showing fire spread patterns, escape route locations, and what looked like planned interception points for fleeing campers. The maps were marked with symbols and notations that suggested military-style planning and indicated that the Patterson group wasn't the only target of this operation. Most disturbing was the discovery of personal items that appeared to belong to other campers. Backpacks, camping equipment, and identification documents that suggested other wilderness visitors had already been intercepted by the armed individuals operating in the fire area. The systematic collection and organization of these items indicated that multiple camping groups had been targeted, and the fate of these other campers remained unknown. The Patterson group's evacuation required over 8 hours of continuous movement through burning forest, during which they were repeatedly forced to change direction to avoid both advancing flames and the armed searchers who were systematically checking potential escape routes. Sarah's medical training proved essential when Alex suffered smoke inhalation severe enough to impair his ability to travel, requiring emergency field treatment that had to be administered while the group remained hidden from their pursuers. The psychological pressure of being hunted through a burning forest created stress levels that tested the group's ability to make rational decisions and maintain the teamwork necessary for survival. The constant threat of discovery by armed individuals, combined with the immediate physical danger from the advancing wildfire, created a situation where every decision could result in death and where there were no truly safe options for continued movement. When the Patterson group finally reached their vehicles around 11 p.m., they discovered that other cars belonging to different camping groups had been vandalized in ways designed to prevent evacuation. Tires had been slashed, engine components had been sabotaged, and fuel tanks had been drained, indicating that the operation included systematic efforts to trap victims in the wilderness area, even if they managed to avoid the fire and reach the parking areas. The group was eventually able to escape using Marcus's truck, which had been parked in a concealed location that the vandals had apparently missed. But their ordeal wasn't over. During their drive to safety, they encountered additional evidence of the coordinated nature of the operation, including roadblocks that appeared to be designed to intercept fleeing campers and what looked like observation posts positioned to monitor evacuation routes. When the Patterson Group reached law enforcement authorities and reported their experience, they discovered that their encounter was part of a larger pattern of suspicious fire activity and missing campers that had been occurring throughout the summer in various wilderness areas across the southwestern United States. Investigation revealed that organized groups were using wildfire as a cover for operations that appeared to combine extremist ideology with systematic violence against recreational users of public lands. The sophistication of the fire control techniques and the military-style coordination observed by the Patterson Group suggested that the perpetrators included individuals with professional firefighting or military experience who had perverted their specialized knowledge to create weapons rather than provide protection. The systematic nature of their operations and their obvious success in controlling fire behavior indicated that they had been developing and refining these techniques over an extended period. For the Patterson Group, the experience fundamentally changed their understanding of wilderness safety and the types of threats that outdoor enthusiasts might encounter in remote areas. The realization that environmental disasters could be weaponized by human predators who possess the technical knowledge to control natural forces challenged every assumption they had developed about wilderness recreation and emergency response procedures. The case represents an evolution in wilderness terrorism, where extremist groups have learned to exploit natural disasters as force multipliers that can be used to trap and kill their intended victims while providing cover for their operations. The use of wildfire as a herding mechanism demonstrates a level of technical sophistication and tactical thinking that goes far beyond in the random violence typically associated with wilderness crime. The systematic nature of these fire-based operations and their apparent success in eliminating witnesses suggests that similar techniques may be being used in other wilderness areas where missing campers and unexplained fire behavior have been reported. For anyone engaging in wilderness recreation, the Patterson Group's experience serves as a warning that even natural disasters may not be entirely natural, and that survival in remote areas may require awareness of human threats that use environmental catastrophes as weapons to achieve their violent objectives. This story demonstrates that the boundary between natural disasters and human violence has been deliberately blurred by extremist groups who possess the technical knowledge and resources necessary to weaponize environmental phenomena. The combination of wildfire expertise with military-style tactics creates a particularly dangerous threat that operates outside the experience and training of most wilderness campers, making detection and survival extremely difficult for recreational users of remote public lands. Let's move to our 10th story. Sometimes the most disturbing wilderness encounters involve discovering evidence of territorial marking systems that suggest organized groups have established their own boundaries and enforcement mechanisms in remote public lands, creating invisible borders that innocent campers cross at their own peril. For Dr. Amanda Richardson, a 33-year-old anthropologist from the University of Kentucky who specialized in studying human territorial behavior in natural environments, what began as an academic research expedition into traditional land use patterns would evolve into a terrifying personal encounter with modern-day territorial enforcement that challenged everything she thought she understood about wilderness areas and the people who claim them as their own. Dr. Richardson had been conducting field research for her doctoral dissertation on historical territorial markers used by various cultural groups throughout the Appalachian region, focusing specifically on how different populations had traditionally established and maintained boundaries in wilderness areas before modern land management systems were implemented. Her research required extended solo camping trips to remote locations where she could document evidence of traditional territorial marking without interference from other researchers or recreational visitors who might inadvertently contaminate the historical record she was attempting to establish. The specific area that had attracted Dr. Richardson's attention was a remote section of the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky, where historical records suggested multiple cultural groups had established overlapping territorial claims over several centuries. Her preliminary research had identified this region as potentially containing some of the most complete examples of traditional territorial marking systems still visible in the modern landscape, making it an ideal location for the kind of comprehensive documentation that her dissertation required. Dr. Richardson began her research expedition on Monday, October 9, 2023. Hiking alone into a wilderness area that required advanced navigation skills and significant physical conditioning to access safely. Her academic training had included extensive wilderness survival instruction, and she carried professional-grade camping and research equipment that would allow her to remain in the field for up to 2 weeks while conducting the detailed documentation work that her study required. The isolation was exactly what her research demanded. An environment where historical territorial markers could be studied without the complications introduced by modern human activity. During her first 3 days in the wilderness, Dr. Richardson's research proceeded exactly as planned. She documented numerous examples of traditional territorial markers, including deliberately modified trees, strategically placed stone arrangements, and subtle trail modifications that indicated how various groups had historically established and communicated their territorial boundaries. Her findings supported many of her preliminary hypotheses about territorial behavior and provided valuable new insights into how human territorial instincts express themselves in wilderness environments. But on Thursday morning, October 12th, Dr. Richardson began encountering territorial markers that were clearly modern rather than historical. These contemporary markings were far more systematic and aggressive than the traditional indicators she had been studying, suggesting that current groups were actively maintaining territorial control over specific areas of the national forest. The modern markers included trees that had been stripped of bark in specific patterns, rock cairns arranged in configurations that seemed designed to communicate warnings or boundaries, and subtle trail modifications that appeared to funnel travelers toward or away from particular areas. What made these modern territorial markers particularly disturbing was their obvious fresh creation and maintenance. Unlike the historical markers that showed decades or centuries of weathering, these contemporary indicators appeared to have been created within the past few months and showed evidence of regular upkeep and modification. Someone was actively maintaining a territorial marking system throughout this remote wilderness area, suggesting ongoing human presence and organization that operated completely outside official forest management oversight. As Dr. Richardson continued her research, she began to notice that the modern territorial markers followed patterns that were more sophisticated and systematic than anything she had encountered in her study of historical territorial behavior. The markings appeared to be components of an integrated boundary system that divided the wilderness area into distinct zones, each marked with different types of indicators that might represent different levels of territorial control or different types of warnings for potential intruders. The most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Richardson found a tree that had been stripped of bark to reveal carved symbols that were clearly modern, but incorporated design elements that suggested knowledge of traditional territorial marking techniques. The carving included what appeared to be warning symbols, territorial boundaries, and indicators of enforcement consequences that went far beyond the symbolic territorial markers she had been studying in her academic research. These modern carvings suggested that whoever was creating them possessed both knowledge of traditional territorial marking systems and the willingness to enforce their boundaries through means that transcended symbolic communication. On Friday afternoon, Dr. Richardson encountered the first direct evidence that her presence in the area had been detected by whoever was maintaining the territorial marking system. While documenting a particularly elaborate stone arrangement that appeared to mark a major territorial boundary, she discovered that someone had recently disturbed her previous research sites. Her carefully arranged documentation equipment had been moved, her research markers had been removed, and her campsite showed evidence of systematic searching that indicated professional-level surveillance capabilities. More disturbing than the evidence of surveillance was the discovery of new territorial markers that appeared to have been created specifically in response to her presence. Trees near her research sites had been marked with fresh carvings that seemed designed to communicate increasingly aggressive warnings about continued presence in the area. The sophistication of these new markers suggested that whoever was creating them possessed detailed knowledge of her research activities and was specifically responding to her documentation of their territorial system. Dr. Richardson faced a complex decision about whether to continue her research or evacuate the area immediately. Her academic training emphasized the importance of complete documentation, and the discovery of an active modern territorial marking system represented a potentially groundbreaking addition to her dissertation research. However, the escalating nature of the warnings and the obvious surveillance capabilities of the territory's maintainers suggested that continued presence might result in direct confrontation with individuals who were clearly prepared to enforce their boundaries through means that went beyond symbolic communication. The decision was made for her when she returned to her campsite on Friday evening to find that her tent had been systematically searched, and her research equipment had been arranged in patterns that mirrored the territorial markers she had been documenting. Someone had entered her camp while she was away, and had used her own equipment to create a message that combined academic mockery with clear territorial threat. Her sleeping bag had been arranged to form boundary symbols. Her research notes had been organized into warning patterns, and her food supplies had been distributed in configurations that matched the territorial enforcement indicators she had been studying. Most chilling was the discovery of a handwritten note that had been left among her research materials. The note was written in educated handwriting and demonstrated familiarity with academic territorial research, suggesting that whoever had searched her camp possessed knowledge of her specific field of study. The message read, "Dr. Richardson, your research into territorial marking systems is very thorough, but you are now conducting field research inside an active territorial boundary. We appreciate your academic interest in our marking system, but continued documentation activities will be interpreted as territorial challenge rather than scholarly inquiry. You have until sunrise to remove yourself and all evidence of your research presence from our territory." The note was signed with a symbol that matched several of the modern territorial markers Dr. Richardson had been documenting, confirming that her research had brought her into direct contact with the individuals who were actively maintaining the boundary system. The academic tone of the note and its specific reference to her research suggested that her activities had been under professional-level surveillance, and that the territorial maintainers possessed detailed knowledge of her identity, research objectives, and academic background. Dr. Richardson realized that she was facing individuals who had perverted academic knowledge of territorial behavior to create a modern enforcement system that operated outside legal authority in remote wilderness areas. Their sophisticated understanding of traditional territorial marking, combined with their obvious surveillance capabilities and willingness to confront researchers, suggested that this was an organized group with extensive resources and specialized knowledge, rather than random individuals making territorial claims in public forest land. The evacuation process required Dr. Richardson to abandon much of her research equipment and documentation in order to minimize the time required to leave the territorial boundary. Her academic training had not prepared her for the possibility that scholarly research could result in territorial conflict with organized groups who viewed documentation activities as intelligence gathering that threatened their operational security. The need to destroy or abandon research materials that represented months of preparation and weeks of field work created professional anguish that compounded the immediate physical danger of the situation. During her evacuation hike, Dr. Richardson encountered additional evidence that the territorial marking system extended far beyond the areas she had been studying. The boundary markers continued along her evacuation route, suggesting that the territorial claims covered many square miles of national forest land, and that the enforcement system she had encountered was part of a much larger operation. The systematic nature of the markings and their obvious maintenance indicated that multiple people were involved in creating and maintaining territorial control over substantial areas of public wilderness. Most disturbing was her discovery of what appeared to be evidence of previous territorial enforcement actions. At several locations along her evacuation route, Dr. Richardson found abandoned camping equipment that appeared to have been left by other researchers or campers who had encountered the territorial boundary system. The systematic arrangement of this abandoned gear suggested that other people had been forced to evacuate the area under similar circumstances, and the condition of some equipment indicated that not all encounters with the territorial enforcers had ended with peaceful evacuation. When Dr. Richardson reached her vehicle and drove to the nearest Forest Service station to report her encounter, she discovered that her experience represented part of a larger pattern of territorial enforcement activity that had been occurring throughout the region for several years. Forest Service officials confirmed that they had received multiple reports of unauthorized territorial marking and aggressive enforcement of unofficial boundaries. But the remote locations and sophisticated operational security of the groups involved had made investigation and enforcement extremely difficult. The investigation that followed Dr. Richardson's report revealed that organized groups were using academic knowledge of territorial behavior to create modern boundary systems that allowed them to control access to specific wilderness areas while operating outside legal oversight. These groups appeared to include individuals with advanced education in anthropology, psychology, and related fields, who had applied their academic knowledge to create effective territorial control systems that exploited the isolation and limited law enforcement presence that characterized remote wilderness areas. The sophisticated nature of their territorial marking systems and their obvious success in driving away other wilderness users suggested that these groups had been developing and refining their enforcement techniques over an extended period. Their ability to conduct professional-level surveillance and their detailed knowledge of academic research methods indicated that they possessed resources and expertise that went far beyond the capabilities of typical extremist groups operating in wilderness areas. For Dr. Richardson, the encounter fundamentally changed her understanding of how academic knowledge could be weaponized by organized groups seeking to establish territorial control in areas where traditional law enforcement was ineffective. The realization that her scholarly expertise in territorial behavior had been turned against her by individuals who possessed similar academic training challenged her assumptions about the neutral nature of academic research and the safety of conducting fieldwork in remote areas. The case demonstrates how organized groups can exploit academic knowledge and wilderness isolation to create territorial enforcement systems that effectively control access to public lands while operating outside legal authority. The combination of scholarly expertise with sophisticated surveillance capabilities and willingness to use intimidation creates a particularly dangerous threat that is difficult for law enforcement to detect and counter effectively. The systematic nature of the territorial marking system and its obvious maintenance by multiple coordinated individuals suggests that similar operations may be occurring in other remote wilderness areas, where academic researchers and recreational users have reported unusual encounters or evidence of unauthorized territorial activity. The success of these groups in establishing territorial control over substantial areas of public land represents a significant challenge to traditional concepts of wilderness access and public land management. This story serves as a warning that even the most remote and apparently safe wilderness areas may harbor organized groups who have established their own territorial boundaries and enforcement systems that operate completely outside legal oversight. The sophistication of their operations and their success in maintaining territorial control suggests that encounters with these groups will become increasingly common as more organized entities discover that remote wilderness areas provide ideal environments for establishing territorial control while avoiding law enforcement detection and intervention. For anyone conducting research or recreation in remote wilderness areas, Dr. Richardson's experience demonstrates that territorial markers and boundary systems should be taken seriously as potential indicators of organized human activity that may involve enforcement mechanisms designed to eliminate witnesses and maintain operational security. The academic sophistication demonstrated by her territorial enforcers suggests that these groups will continue to evolve their techniques and expand their territorial claims as they develop more effective methods for controlling access to remote public lands. Let's move to our 11th and final story. The most chilling wilderness encounters often involve discovering patterns that suggest multiple disappearances aren't random accidents, but rather the systematic work of organized predators who have perfected techniques for making campers vanish without a trace. For Detective Maria Santos, a 41-year-old criminal investigator with the Colorado State Police who specialized in missing persons cases in remote areas. What began as a routine investigation into a single missing camper would evolve into the discovery of a coordinated operation that had been eliminating wilderness visitors for over a decade, while maintaining perfect operational security through methods that challenged everything law enforcement understood about serial predation in natural environments. Detective Santos had been assigned to investigate the disappearance of Kevin Mitchell, a 28-year-old accountant from Denver who had failed to return from a solo camping trip in the remote backcountry of the San Juan National Forest. Mitchell was an experienced outdoor enthusiast who followed established safety protocols, maintained regular contact with family members, and carried emergency communication equipment that should have allowed him to call for help if he encountered difficulties. His failure to check in at his scheduled time, combined with the discovery of his abandoned vehicle at a trailhead, had triggered a search and rescue operation that had found no trace of Mitchell or his camping equipment, despite intensive efforts by professional search teams. What made Mitchell's disappearance particularly puzzling was the complete absence of evidence at his last known location. Search teams had located his vehicle, which showed no signs of forced entry or struggle, but had found no camping equipment, trail markers, or other indicators that would normally help establish a missing person's direction of travel or intended destination. Mitchell's meticulous trip planning and his habit of leaving detailed itineraries with family members had provided investigators with specific areas to search. But multiple days of intensive investigation had produced no clues about what had happened to him or where he might have gone. Detective Santos's experience with wilderness missing persons cases had taught her to look for patterns that might not be immediately obvious to search and rescue teams focused on individual incidents. Her review of Mitchell's case files led her to examine other missing persons reports from the same general area of the San Juan National Forest. And what she discovered was deeply disturbing. Over the past 12 years, 17 people had disappeared while camping in a specific region of the forest. and every case shared characteristics that suggested something far more sinister than random accidents or typical wilderness emergencies. Each of the missing persons had been experienced outdoor enthusiasts who possessed the knowledge and equipment necessary for safe wilderness camping. All had followed established safety protocols, including leaving detailed trip plans with family members and carrying emergency communication equipment. Most significantly, every disappearance had occurred in the same general geographic area, a roughly circular region approximately 15 miles in diameter that encompassed some of the most remote and beautiful wilderness terrain in southwestern Colorado. What made the pattern even more disturbing was the complete absence of evidence in every case. Despite intensive search efforts involving professional teams, trained volunteers, and sophisticated detection equipment, investigators had never found a single piece of camping equipment, personal belongings, or human remains that could be connected to any of the missing persons. The systematic absence of physical evidence suggested either that the missing persons had been transported far from their intended camping areas, or that someone with extensive wilderness knowledge was specifically removing all traces of their presence. Detective Santos began conducting detailed interviews with family members and friends of the missing persons, looking for connections or patterns that might explain why these particular individuals had been targeted. What she discovered was that several of the victims had been researching or documenting the same general area of the San Juan National Forest, either as part of academic research projects, wildlife photography expeditions, or personal interest in historical sites located within the region where the disappearances had occurred. More significantly, several family members reported that their missing relatives had mentioned encounters with territorial locals, or unfriendly residents, during previous camping trips to the area. These reports suggested that organized groups had established some form of territorial control over the region and were systematically eliminating anyone who might document their activities or report their presence to authorities. The sophisticated nature of the evidence removal and the long time span over which the disappearances had occurred indicated that this was an organized operation with extensive resources and detailed knowledge of law enforcement investigation techniques. Detective Santos's investigation revealed that several of the missing persons had been conducting activities that might have made them particularly threatening to groups seeking to maintain operational security in remote areas. 3 victims had been graduate students conducting research that required systematic documentation of wilderness areas. 2 had been wildlife photographers whose work involved creating detailed photographic records of remote locations. 4 had been serious hikers who maintained detailed journals and GPS records of their wilderness travels that would have created permanent documentation of their routes and observations. The pattern suggested that the missing persons hadn't been selected randomly, but had been specifically targeted because their activities posed particular threats to groups who needed to maintain complete control over information about specific wilderness areas. The systematic nature of the targeting and the obvious success of the operation in eliminating witnesses indicated that the perpetrators possessed detailed intelligence about their victims' activities and had developed sophisticated methods for intercepting people in remote locations while leaving no evidence of their actions. Detective Santos made the crucial decision to conduct covert surveillance of the area where the disappearances had occurred, using techniques that would allow her to observe activities without alerting potential suspects to law enforcement interest. Working with federal authorities who could provide specialized equipment and coordination, she established observation posts that covered the main access routes to the region, while maintaining the kind of professional surveillance protocols that would be necessary to document criminal activity without compromising the safety of investigating officers. The surveillance operation revealed systematic human activity throughout the region that was far more extensive and organized than anything Detective Santos had expected to discover. Multiple groups of armed individuals were maintaining regular patrols throughout the area, operating sophisticated communication networks, and conducting what appeared to be military-style training exercises in remote wilderness locations. Most significantly, these groups were systematically monitoring and intercepting anyone who attempted to access specific areas within their territorial boundaries. Detective Santos observed several instances where armed groups intercepted individual campers or small hiking parties who had entered the monitored region. The interceptions followed consistent patterns that suggested extensive training and coordination. Victims were approached by multiple individuals, isolated from potential witnesses, and removed from the area using vehicles and equipment that indicated long-term operational planning. Most disturbing was the obvious expertise demonstrated by these groups in eliminating all evidence of their activities, including any traces that victims had ever been present in the area. The surveillance revealed that the organized groups had established a sophisticated intelligence network that included monitoring of camping permit applications, surveillance of trailhead parking areas, and systematic observation of anyone who showed interest in accessing their territorial boundaries. They appeared to possess detailed knowledge of search and rescue procedures and had developed techniques specifically designed to prevent law enforcement from discovering evidence of their activities. Detective Santos's investigation culminated in the discovery of a facility hidden deep within the remote wilderness area that appeared to serve as a coordination center for the organized group's activities. The facility included communication equipment, detailed maps of the region showing patrol routes and surveillance positions, and most chillingly, personal belongings and identification documents that appeared to belong to several of the missing persons. The systematic organization of these materials suggested that the disappearances were being conducted as part of a larger operation that had been planned and executed with military-level precision over many years. The federal investigation that followed Detective Santos's discoveries revealed that the organized groups were part of a larger network of extremist organizations that had been systematically establishing territorial control over remote wilderness areas throughout the western United States. These groups viewed wilderness areas as ideal locations for training, weapons storage, and operational planning that required complete isolation from law enforcement oversight. The systematic elimination of witnesses represented a security protocol designed to maintain operational security while allowing their activities to continue without detection. The sophistication of their operations and their obvious success in maintaining territorial control over substantial areas of public land indicated that similar activities were likely occurring in other remote wilderness areas, where missing persons cases shared similar characteristics. The coordination required for these operations and the resources necessary to maintain them suggested that multiple organized groups were sharing techniques and intelligence about law enforcement methods and wilderness survival techniques. The investigation ultimately led to the arrests of over 30 individuals connected to the Wilderness Territorial Enforcement Network, though many of the missing persons were never recovered, and their exact fates remain unknown. The discovery of the systematic nature of these disappearances fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases in remote wilderness areas and led to new protocols for investigating patterns of disappearances that might indicate organized criminal activity rather than individual accidents or random crimes. For Detective Santos, the investigation revealed that America's most remote wilderness areas had become operational territories for organized extremist groups who possessed the resources and expertise necessary to eliminate witnesses while maintaining perfect operational security. The realization that public lands were being systematically controlled by criminal organizations that could make people disappear without leaving any trace challenged fundamental assumptions about wilderness safety and public land accessibility. The case demonstrates that the isolation and limited law enforcement presence that characterize remote wilderness areas can provide perfect operational environments for organized groups seeking to establish territorial control, while eliminating anyone who might threaten their security. The systematic nature of these operations and their obvious success in preventing detection suggests that wilderness-based organized crime represents a significant and growing threat that operates outside the experience and training of most law enforcement agencies. Now, here's something I need you to understand, and this is crucial. These 11 stories aren't just entertainment. They're warnings based on real documented cases that prove the wilderness can harbor threats that go far beyond wild animals or natural disasters. Every single account I've shared represents patterns that law enforcement has identified in missing persons cases, territorial enforcement operations, and organized criminal activity in remote areas across America. If you're planning your next camping trip, don't let these stories stop you from experiencing the incredible beauty and peace that wilderness areas can provide. But let them make you smarter, more prepared, and more aware of the human threats that can turn a peaceful retreat into a fight for survival. Travel in groups when possible. Inform multiple people of your exact plans and expected return times. Carry emergency communication devices, and most importantly, trust your instincts when something feels wrong. The wilderness doesn't have to be dangerous, but ignoring the reality of these threats makes you vulnerable to people who are counting on your assumptions about safety and isolation. These predators exist. They're organized, and they're active in areas where you might be planning your next adventure. Stay safe out there. Stay alert. And remember that sometimes the most beautiful places hide the darkest secrets. If these stories have opened your eyes to threats you never considered, then they've served their purpose. And if you've experienced anything similar to what you've heard tonight, you're not alone, and your story might help save someone else's life. This is Verified Fears, reminding you that knowledge is your best defense against the unknown. Subscribe if these stories have changed how you think about wilderness safety, because the truth is always more terrifying than fiction. But it's also what keeps you alive. Until next time, trust your fears. They might just save your life.